If you love gripping stories that pull you in and don't let go, you're in the right place. This is Mr. Gray Stories. Gerald had spent the entire drive across Birmingham telling himself that nobody from his marriage would see him there. That was the reason he had chosen the restaurant. It was far enough from the neighborhood where he and Cynthia lived, tucked into a busy part of downtown where people came and went without paying much attention to one another. Gerald had checked the reservation twice before leaving work. He had even arrived early, choosing a table toward the back of the dining room. He wanted privacy. More than that, he wanted the feeling of having a life that belonged only to him. Across the table, Zoe looked at him over the rim of her water glass. She had been quiet for several minutes. That wasn't like her. Usually Zoe could talk to Gerald for hours. She could ask about his work, complain about her own day, laugh at things that weren't particularly funny, and make him feel as though the rest of the world had disappeared. Tonight she seemed distracted. Gerald noticed. "What?" Zoe lowered her glass. "When are you going to stop hiding me?" Gerald leaned back in his chair. "I'm not hiding you." She gave him a look. "Gerald." He glanced around the restaurant before looking back at her. "We're having dinner." "That's not what I asked," he sighed. "We've talked about this." "No, you've talked about it." Zoe folded her hands on the table. "You keep telling me things are going to change. They are." "When?" Gerald looked at her. "After tonight." Zoe didn't respond immediately. Gerald reached across the table and touched her hand. "Things are going to change," he repeated. She searched his face. "You mean it?" "Yes." For the first time that evening, Zoe smiled. Gerald smiled back. He wanted to believe his own promise. He had spent months telling himself that eventually he would deal with his marriage properly. Eventually, he would tell Cynthia the truth. Eventually, he would decide what he wanted. Tonight, he had convinced himself that he was finally ready. The waiter approached their table. Gerald looked up. "Ready for the check?" The waiter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a small cream-colored envelope beside Gerald's plate. Gerald looked down, then back at the waiter. "I'm sorry?" The waiter gave him a polite nod. "Your wife sent this." Gerald stopped breathing for a moment. His fingers remained on the table. Zoe's smile disappeared. Gerald stared at the envelope as though it had somehow appeared there by mistake. "My wife?" The waiter nodded. "She asked me to make sure you received it." Gerald looked toward the dining room. People were talking, silverware moved across plates. A couple near the window laughed. Someone at the bar was speaking loudly enough for half the room to hear. Everything looked normal. But Gerald no longer felt like he was sitting in an ordinary restaurant. His eyes returned to the envelope. There was no name written across the front. He knew who it was from. He knew before he touched it. Cynthia, his wife, the woman he had told he was working late, the woman who believed he was somewhere else tonight, the woman he had spent months convincing himself didn't know the truth. Zoe leaned closer. "What does it say?" Gerald didn't answer. He picked up the envelope. His hands were suddenly unsteady. Zoe watched him. "Gerald?" He looked at her. For the first time since they had sat down, he had nothing reassuring to say. The waiter stepped back from the table. "I'll give you a moment." He walked away. Gerald remained frozen. Zoe looked at the envelope. "Open it." Gerald swallowed. He turned it over. Still no name, no explanation. Just the knowledge that Cynthia had somehow reached him in a place he had deliberately chosen because he believed she would never find him. And that was the part he couldn't understand. How did she know? Why hadn't she called? Why hadn't she confronted him? Why had she sent a message through the restaurant instead? Gerald slowly slid one finger beneath the flap. He opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. He pulled it out. His eyes moved across the first line. His face changed. Zoe noticed immediately. "What does it say?" Gerald didn't answer. He read the line again. This time his stomach tightened, because Cynthia wasn't asking where he was. She already knew. She wasn't asking who he was with. She already knew enough to ask a different question. Gerald looked across the table at Zoe. For the first time, Zoe understood that whatever Cynthia had written inside that envelope, Gerald's marriage was not as unaware of their relationship as he had made her believe. And Gerald had no idea what Cynthia would do next. Welcome to Mr. Gray Stories. Stories of choices, consequences, and moments that can change everything. Let's begin. Gerald read the note a second time. His eyes stayed on the same sentence. "I wanted to know whether you would tell me the truth before I had to prove it." He lowered the paper. Zoe was still watching him. "What does it say?" Gerald folded the note once. "Nothing." Zoe stared at him. "That's not nothing." He looked toward the waiter, but the man was already several tables away. Gerald's attention returned to the envelope. There was no return address, No explanation, no accusation written across the front, just Cynthia's handwriting. He knew it immediately. He had seen that handwriting on grocery lists stuck to their refrigerator, on birthday cards, on notes she left beside his lunch when she knew he was going to have a long day. Seeing it there, in that restaurant, felt different. It wasn't the handwriting that frightened him. It was what it meant. Cynthia knew. Zoe leaned forward. She knows about us, doesn't she? Gerald didn't answer. Gerald, he rubbed his forehead. I don't know what she knows. Zoe's expression hardened. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. She had stopped smiling. The excitement she had carried into the restaurant was gone. You told me she didn't know, Zoe said. I thought she didn't. You thought? Gerald looked down at the note. He could hear the words again. Before I had to prove it. That wasn't the message of a woman guessing. That was the message of someone who had been watching. Someone who had been waiting. Someone who had finally decided she didn't need to ask the same question twice. Gerald swallowed. I need to talk to her. Zoe sat back. Now? Yes. You said tonight was about us. I know. Then why are you leaving? Gerald looked at her. Because my wife just sent me a note at a restaurant. She knows I'm sitting in with you. Zoe's face tightened. How did she know? I don't know. Did you tell her? No. Did somebody see you? I don't know. Did you tell anyone where you were going? No. Zoe stared at him. Neither of them had an answer. Gerald looked around the room again. He suddenly felt exposed. Every person near them seemed capable of knowing something about him. The couple at the next table, the bartender, the hostess, the waiter who had delivered the envelope. He knew none of them. Yet somehow Cynthia had found this place. He stood. Zoe looked up at him. What are you doing? I'm going home. She remained seated. Gerald, he stopped. Before you go, answer one question. He waited. How much did you tell me that wasn't true? Gerald looked at her. She didn't raise her voice. That made the question harder. I told you the truth about how I felt. That's not what I asked. He looked away. Zoe continued. You told me your marriage was basically over. It was in a bad place. You told me Cynthia knew you were unhappy. She knew we were having problems. You told me you were going to leave. I said I was thinking about it. Zoe gave a quiet, disappointed laugh. You said you were leaving. Gerald didn't respond. Zoe looked down at the envelope. Does she know my name? Gerald's silence answered her. Zoe's face changed. She knows my name. I don't know. You just looked at me like you know. Gerald sat back down. He didn't have the energy to keep pretending. Yes. Zoe stared at him. How? I don't know. That answer frustrated her. Stop saying that. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me the truth. Gerald looked at her. For a second, the irony of the sentence was almost unbearable. The woman sitting across from him was asking for the same thing Cynthia had been asking for. He lowered his eyes. I should have told her. Zoe's voice softened. You should have told both of us. Gerald looked up. She continued. You kept telling me Cynthia was the reason you couldn't move forward. Maybe the problem wasn't Cynthia. He didn't answer. The waiter returned to the table. Is everything all right? Gerald looked at him. Who gave you this? The waiter glanced at the envelope. Your wife. I know that. I mean, when did she give it to you? Earlier this afternoon. Gerald's face tightened. She came here? The waiter nodded. Yes. Zoe looked at Gerald. He turned toward the waiter. Was she alone? Yes. Gerald's heart sank. Did she say anything? The waiter hesitated. She asked me to make sure you received the envelope. That's it? That's it. Gerald stared at him. Did she wait? No. How long was she here? Not long. Gerald nodded slowly. The waiter stepped away. Zoe watched Gerald. She came here. Gerald nodded. She knew. Zoe's voice was quieter now. She could have walked in. Gerald looked at her. But she didn't. No. Why? Gerald looked at the folded note in his hand. That was the question he couldn't answer. Cynthia had every reason to confront him. She could have walked into the restaurant. She could have stood beside their table. She could have asked Zoe who she was. She could have called him before he arrived. She could have waited outside. She could have made the entire evening public. She had done none of those things. Instead, she had come alone, left an envelope, and walked away. That bothered Gerald more than an angry confrontation might have. Because anger was familiar. Cynthia's restraint was not. Zoe stood. Are you going to call her? Gerald took out his phone. He opened Cynthia's name. His thumb hovered over the screen. He didn't press call. "What are you waiting for?" Zoe asked. Gerald looked at the phone. "I don't know what to say." Zoe shook her head. "Maybe that's the first honest thing you've said tonight." Gerald put the phone away. He wasn't ready. Not because he didn't know what he had done. He knew. He wasn't ready because he suddenly understood that Cynthia had already moved beyond the question he had been avoiding. She wasn't trying to catch him anymore. She was deciding what his answers meant. Gerald looked once more at the restaurant table. The dinner he had imagined would mark the beginning of his future with Zoe now felt like evidence of everything he had failed to handle honestly. Zoe picked up her purse. "I'm leaving." Gerald looked at her. "Zoe." "No," she shook her head. "Don't promise me anything tonight." He stopped. She continued. "Go home." Gerald watched her walk away. He remained standing beside the table. For months he had believed the hardest conversation would be telling Cynthia about Zoe. Now he understood that the harder conversation had already begun. It had started with a small envelope, and Cynthia wasn't there to help him through it. She had left him alone with the truth. That was why Gerald couldn't stop thinking about one question. Why had Cynthia chosen to send the message instead of confronting him herself? He didn't know. He would have to go home to find out. And the answer had begun long before that Thursday night. It had begun with a marriage that, from the outside, still looked perfectly ordinary. A marriage where two people still shared a home, bought groceries, asked about each other's day, and said goodnight. A marriage where one woman had slowly begun to notice that the man she loved was becoming harder to reach. Her name was Cynthia. She was 29 years old, and by the time she understood what Gerald had been hiding, she had already spent months wondering whether the silence between them meant nothing at all, or whether it meant everything. 2 years into her marriage to Gerald, Cynthia had learned that a relationship did not always change through one terrible argument. Sometimes it changed through ordinary mornings. That Thursday began with the sound of the coffee maker. Cynthia was standing at the kitchen counter in their Birmingham apartment, packing Gerald's lunch into a plastic container. Chicken, rice, green beans. She had made the same combination several times, because Gerald had once told her that it was the kind of lunch that made him feel like somebody cared whether he ate properly. She remembered things like that. She remembered what people said when they weren't trying to make an impression. Gerald walked into the kitchen already dressed for work. "Morning." Cynthia glanced over her shoulder. "Morning." He opened the refrigerator. "You got any coffee?" "It's in the pot." He poured himself a cup. For several seconds, the only sounds in the kitchen were the refrigerator humming and the spoon tapping against his mug. Cynthia looked at him. There had been a time when Gerald could enter a room and immediately start talking. He would complain about traffic before checking the weather. He would tell her about something ridiculous a tenant had done. He would ask what she had planned for the weekend even when it was only Tuesday. 2 years earlier, their mornings had rarely been quiet. Their apartment wasn't large. There was barely enough counter space when they both tried to prepare breakfast. Gerald's work shoes usually sat near the front door. Cynthia's hair products covered one side of the bathroom mirror. Their grocery list stayed on the refrigerator under a magnet shaped like a lemon. They had argued about the thermostat. They had argued about how often they should eat out. Cynthia had once accused Gerald of buying work shoes as though he expected his feet to grow. Gerald had responded that a man needed options. She had laughed so hard that she nearly dropped the laundry basket she was carrying. Those little disagreements had never felt threatening. They were simply part of being married. Now, Cynthia sometimes found herself missing the arguments. At least arguments meant they were talking. She placed the lid on Gerald's lunch container. "Your lunch is in your bag." He looked toward the counter. "Thanks. Don't leave it in the car this time." "I won't." He picked up his work bag. Cynthia waited. There was a familiar little pause. She expected him to walk over. He usually kissed her before leaving. Sometimes it was a quick kiss on the lips. Sometimes he kissed her forehead if he was already rushing. That morning, he simply adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "I'll see you later." Then he walked toward the door. Cynthia watched him put on his shoes. The door opened. He stepped outside. The door closed. She stood there. It wasn't the missing kiss itself that bothered her. It was the fact that she had noticed. Cynthia looked at the closed door. For a moment she considered calling him back. She didn't. Instead, she picked up his coffee mug and carried it to the sink. Marriage changed. She knew that. People got busy. Schedules changed. The first year of marriage was different from the second. There was less excitement about ordinary things, more bills, more responsibilities, more work. Maybe that was all this was. She rinsed the mug. "You're overthinking it," she told herself. She said it quietly, almost as though another person were standing in the kitchen. Then she went to her laptop. Cynthia worked in healthcare administration, and her workday usually gave her little room to sit around thinking about her personal life. There were schedules to check, patient records to review, insurance questions, staff concerns, emails that required answers, small problems that could become large problems if nobody dealt with them quickly. Cynthia liked that part of her job. Work gave her something her marriage didn't. A problem usually had a beginning and an end. If a schedule was wrong, she fixed it. If paperwork was missing, she found it. If someone needed an answer, she looked for the information. Her marriage didn't work that way. There was no form for emotional distance, no procedure for a husband who seemed present but increasingly unavailable, no clear answer to the question she had begun asking herself. When does being busy become something else? She pushed the thought aside. By 9:30 she was deep into work. Gerald's job was different. He worked in commercial property management, dealing with tenants, contractors, maintenance issues, inspections, property owners, and people who could turn a broken air conditioning unit into an emergency requiring his immediate attention. His schedule had always been unpredictable. Cynthia knew that. She had never expected him to walk through the front door at exactly the same time every evening. There were legitimate reasons he could be late. A tenant could have a problem. A contractor could cancel. A property owner could need something handled before morning. She understood. The problem was that work had slowly become the explanation for almost everything. Dinner, something came up. Saturday morning, I've got to stop by the office. A phone on silent? Meeting. Thursday evening, client dinner. Cynthia hadn't questioned every explanation. She didn't want to become the wife who interrogated her husband every time he walked through the door. She trusted him. At least she believed she did. Around lunchtime, Cynthia received a message from Gerald. Running late today. Don't wait for me. She stared at the screen. She typed, okay, then deleted it. She typed, everything okay? She deleted that too. Finally, she sent, okay. She placed her phone face down. A few minutes later, she picked it up again. No new message. She laughed quietly at herself. This was ridiculous. Gerald had a job. She had a job. People had responsibilities. She wasn't going to turn a late evening into a problem. That night, Gerald came home after 9. Cynthia was sitting on the couch. He walked through the door looking tired. Hey. He put his keys down. Sorry. For what? Getting home late. She shrugged. It's okay. He looked at her for a moment. You eat? Yeah. Good. He walked toward the kitchen. Cynthia watched him. There was nothing obviously wrong. That was what made it difficult. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't angry. He wasn't avoiding her in any obvious way. He was simply elsewhere. His body was in their apartment. His attention seemed to belong to another part of his life. Cynthia turned off the television. How was work? Busy. Anything serious? Nothing major. She nodded. Gerald opened the refrigerator. There's chicken in there. I know. He smiled slightly. You always save me food. You always say you're hungry when you get home. I am hungry. She smiled. For a few seconds, the old familiarity returned. Then Gerald's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. He picked up the phone. Cynthia noticed. He turned away before answering the message. She looked back at the television. She didn't ask. That was becoming a habit. The following week, Cynthia discovered that Gerald had changed the password on his phone. It happened by accident. His phone was lying on the kitchen counter beside a glass of water. Cynthia picked it up because she wanted to move it away from the edge. She entered the number she had known for almost 2 years. The screen remained locked. She tried again. Nothing. Gerald was in the shower. Cynthia stood there holding his phone. She wasn't trying to get into it. She knew that. At least that's what she told herself. She could have waited until he came out. She could have asked. Instead, she placed the phone back exactly where it had been. When Gerald walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, she was making coffee. Did you change your password? He looked at her. Yeah. When? Last week. Oh. He opened the refrigerator. Cynthia waited. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe he had simply forgotten to tell her. Maybe he would laugh. Maybe he would say something like, I finally got tired of using that old number. Instead, he took out a bottle of water. Why? I couldn't unlock it. He nodded. Changed it last week. Okay. He opened the bottle. That was the end of the conversation. Cynthia turned back toward the coffee maker. She felt foolish. Married people were allowed to have privacy. She knew that. Gerald was entitled to a private phone. She was entitled to one too. There was nothing wrong with that. Still, as she watched him walk away, another thought entered her mind. Privacy and secrecy were not exactly the same thing. She didn't know which one she was looking at. That evening, they sat on opposite ends of the couch. Gerald watched television while checking his phone. Cynthia worked on something from her office. At one point, Gerald laughed. She looked up. "What?" He looked at her. "What? You laughed." "Oh," he smiled. "Something I saw." "What was it?" "Nothing." Cynthia smiled. "Must have been funny." "It was." She returned to her laptop. A few minutes later, Gerald's phone vibrated again. He glanced at it. This time he stood. "I'm going to take this." Cynthia looked up. "Okay." He walked toward the hallway. She watched him disappear around the corner. She didn't follow. She didn't even consider it, but she noticed. That was becoming the problem. She noticed where he went. She noticed when he left the room. She noticed how quickly he turned his screen away. She noticed that he had stopped telling her small things. She noticed that their conversations had become shorter. She noticed that he sometimes came home and seemed surprised to find her awake. None of those things proved anything. Cynthia knew that. She also knew that something had changed. She just didn't know what. One Saturday morning, Gerald was getting ready for work when Cynthia stood in the bedroom doorway. "You're going in today?" "Just for a little while." "On Saturday?" "Yeah." "Everything okay?" "Yeah." She nodded. He picked up his keys. "I'll be back before lunch." "Okay." He walked toward her. For a second, Cynthia thought he might kiss her. Instead, he touched her arm. "I'll see you later." He left. Cynthia remained in the doorway. She didn't follow him. She didn't call him. She didn't ask another question. She simply stood there thinking about how often she had started accepting incomplete answers. That bothered her more than Gerald's schedule. Because she knew herself. Cynthia had always been observant. At work, people trusted her because she caught things other people missed. A missing date, a wrong number, a scheduling conflict, a document that didn't belong in the right folder. She noticed small inconsistencies for a living, yet inside her own marriage she had begun telling herself not to notice. She went back to the kitchen. The lemon-shaped magnet was still on the refrigerator. The grocery list was still underneath it. Gerald's old work shoes were still near the front door. Everything looked familiar. Cynthia stood in the middle of the apartment. For the first time, she understood that familiar did not necessarily mean unchanged. She picked up her phone. There was no message from Gerald. She placed it back on the counter. She didn't know what was happening in her marriage. She wasn't ready to accuse him. She wasn't even ready to call herself suspicious. But she had started noticing things she used to ignore. And once a person begins paying attention to the changes inside their own home, it becomes difficult to convince themselves that nothing has changed at all. The first Thursday Cynthia paid close attention to was not unusual enough to frighten her. That was what made it easy to dismiss. Gerald came home late. He had already mentioned earlier that he would be working late, so when the clock moved past 8, Cynthia didn't think much of it. At 8:30 she checked her phone. No message. At 9 she put his dinner in the refrigerator. At 9:40 she heard his key in the lock. Gerald stepped inside. Hey, he set his keys down. "Sorry." Cynthia looked up from the couch. "You said you'd be late." "I know." He loosened his tie. "It just took longer than I expected." She nodded. "You hungry?" "Not really." He walked toward the kitchen anyway. Cynthia watched him open the refrigerator. "There's a plate in there. I'll eat later." "Okay." Gerald closed the refrigerator. He walked over and kissed her forehead. It was a small gesture, familiar, almost enough to make Cynthia feel silly for noticing anything at all. She reached for the remote. "What happened at work?" "Tenant issue." "What kind?" "Maintenance." She waited. Gerald looked at her. "What?" "Nothing." "You were about to ask something." "No, I wasn't." He smiled faintly. "Okay." He walked into the bedroom. Cynthia watched him disappear. She didn't know what she had almost asked. Maybe she had wanted details. Maybe she wanted him to volunteer them. She didn't want to have to pull information out of him. That night, she went to bed before he did. She heard him moving around the apartment. A cabinet opened, the bathroom door closed, water ran. Eventually he came into the bedroom. Cynthia kept her eyes closed. The mattress shifted. Gerald settled beside her. "Good night." She waited a moment. "Good night." That should have been the end of it. But Cynthia remained awake for several minutes. She was thinking about how easily Gerald had explained the evening. Tenant issue. Maintenance. Nothing serious. There was nothing suspicious about that. Nothing by itself. She knew that. So she let it go. The following Thursday, Gerald mentioned dinner while they were having breakfast. "I've got something tonight." Cynthia looked up. "Work?" "Yeah." "What time?" "Probably late." She nodded. "Okay." Gerald took another sip of coffee. "I might grab something downtown." "All right." He looked at her. "You need anything?" No. Okay. The conversation moved on. Cynthia didn't think about it again until that evening. Gerald left shortly after 6. He wore a dark shirt she had seen him wear to work before. He checked his phone twice before leaving, then once more after he had already opened the door. Cynthia noticed. She said nothing. After he left, she washed the dishes, she watched television, she answered a few work emails. At 7:30, Gerald sent a message. Still tied up? Don't wait. Cynthia read it. She placed the phone down. Something about the message bothered her. She couldn't explain why. Maybe because he had started saying don't wait so often. Maybe because she couldn't remember the last Thursday evening they had spent together. She looked at the clock, then at the dinner she had prepared. She put the food away. When Gerald finally came home, it was almost 10. He entered quietly. Cynthia was still awake. "You've got to stop staying up for me," he said. "I wasn't waiting." He smiled. "Sure." She smiled back. He walked toward her. "How was your evening?" "Fine. What'd you do?" "Worked. Watched television." "Exciting. Very." Gerald laughed. For a moment it felt normal. Then he leaned down and kissed her. Cynthia wrapped her arms around him. She didn't know why that moment made her sad. Maybe because affection had become something that happened between periods of distance, instead of something that connected them throughout the day. Gerald pulled back. "I'm tired." "I know." He went to the bedroom. Cynthia remained on the couch. She looked at the clock. 10:03, Thursday. She didn't know why she remembered the day so clearly. But she did. A few days later, Cynthia was looking for a pen. She had a phone number written on a piece of paper and couldn't find anything to write with. She checked the kitchen drawer. Nothing. The desk. Nothing. She remembered Gerald's work bag sitting near the bedroom door. She walked over. She wasn't searching through it. She knew that distinction mattered to her. She opened the outer pocket. There was a pen. She reached for it. A folded receipt was underneath. Cynthia paused. She picked it up. A restaurant downtown. She recognized the name. She had been there once with Gerald during their first year of marriage. It was not an inexpensive place. She unfolded the receipt. 2 entrees, 2 drinks, dessert. Her eyes moved to the date. Thursday. Cynthia stood very still. She looked at the receipt again. The total was higher than she expected. She read the date one more time. Thursday. She remembered that evening. Gerald had told her he had been working late. He had come home after 9. He had said he wasn't hungry. Cynthia folded the receipt. For a moment she considered walking into the bedroom and asking him about it. She didn't. She put the receipt back, exactly where she had found it. Then she closed the bag. She returned to the kitchen with the pen. She wrote down the phone number. Her handwriting looked normal. Her hands did not feel normal. Cynthia sat at the table. She stared at the piece of paper. 2 entrees, 2 drinks, dessert. It could have been a business dinner. That was possible. Gerald worked with property owners. He dealt with contractors. He met people. There were legitimate reasons for him to eat at a restaurant. But the receipt had landed on top of several other small things. The changed password, the Thursday evenings, the phone, the late nights. She didn't have proof of anything. She had a question. There was a difference. That evening, Gerald came home around 8:30. Cynthia was making pasta. He walked into the kitchen. "That smells good. You hungry?" "Yeah." He washed his hands. "What are we having?" "Pasta. Good." Cynthia glanced at him. He looked completely ordinary. Work shirt, work pants, his watch, his familiar expression. She wondered whether he knew there was a receipt in his bag. Probably not. Gerald walked behind her and kissed the side of her head. Cynthia closed her eyes for a second. She wanted to enjoy it. She really did. Instead, the image of the receipt came back. 2 entrees, 2 drinks, dessert, Thursday. She put the pasta on the plates. "Here, thanks." They sat down. Gerald started talking about one of the properties. A tenant had complained about something. A contractor had delayed a repair. Cynthia listened. She asked a few questions. Gerald answered. Everything sounded ordinary. That was the problem. There was nothing about him that looked like the man she was beginning to suspect. After dinner, they stood together at the sink. Gerald washed. Cynthia dried. He nudged her with his elbow. "You're in my way." "Our way." He laughed. "Fine." She smiled. For a few minutes they worked side by side. It reminded Cynthia of their first year. Back then, these little moments had felt like proof that they were building a life together. Now she found herself studying them, trying to determine whether the closeness was still real. Gerald's phone vibrated on the counter. He looked at it. His face changed. Not much, but enough. Cynthia saw the smile disappear from his mouth. He dried his hands. "I'm going to take this." "Okay." He picked up the phone and walked toward the hallway. Cynthia watched him. He didn't answer immediately. He waited until he was several steps away. Then he answered. She couldn't hear the other person. She couldn't hear most of what Gerald said. She heard only a few words. Yeah. A pause. No, I'm still here. Another pause. I'll call you later. He turned slightly away from the kitchen. Cynthia looked down at the dish towel in her hands. She didn't move. A minute later, Gerald returned. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah. Work? Something like that. She nodded. She could have asked more. She didn't. That night, Cynthia lay beside Gerald in the dark. He fell asleep quickly. She remained awake. She wasn't thinking about one phone call. She was thinking about the receipt, and the Thursday before that, and the Thursday before that. She began counting backward. She remembered how often Gerald had mentioned work, how many times he had come home late, how many times she had eaten alone, how many times she had accepted something came up without asking what had actually happened. She turned onto her side. She didn't want to check his phone. She didn't want to search his bag. She didn't want to become suspicious of everything he did. But she also didn't want to be foolish. Those two fears sat uncomfortably beside each other. The next morning, Gerald was already dressed. He was standing in front of the mirror fixing his collar. Cynthia watched him from the doorway. Going in early? Yeah. Everything okay? Yeah. He looked at her through the mirror. You keep asking me that. She smiled. Because you keep saying yeah. He laughed. Fair. He turned toward her. For a second, Cynthia thought he might say something more. Instead, he walked over and kissed her. Have a good day. You too. He left. Cynthia stood there. She wasn't angry, not yet. She wasn't even certain Gerald had done anything wrong. But she knew something. The receipt wasn't isolated. The Thursday evenings weren't isolated. The phone calls weren't isolated. The changes in Gerald weren't isolated. They were beginning to form a pattern. And that pattern frightened her because she still didn't know what it meant. That was the hardest part. If Gerald had simply stopped loving her, Cynthia could have understood what she was facing. If he had told her he wanted a different life, at least she would have had the truth. But he was still kissing her goodbye, still asking whether she needed anything from the store, still bringing home groceries, still laughing with her sometimes, still telling her he loved her. And somehow, those ordinary signs of affection made the questions harder. Because Cynthia wasn't trying to prove Gerald was a bad husband. She was trying to understand why the man she loved had started behaving like there was a part of his life she wasn't supposed to see. She looked at the calendar on her phone. Thursday was circled only because of a work meeting. She stared at the day. Then she locked the screen. She wasn't ready to accuse Gerald. She wasn't ready to search through his things. She wasn't ready to decide what the receipt meant. But she could no longer tell herself it meant nothing. It wasn't one receipt anymore. It was a pattern. The Thursday after Cynthia found the restaurant receipt, Gerald came home later than usual. She heard his key turn in the lock a little after 9. By that point, she had already eaten. The kitchen was clean. The television was on, but the volume was low. Cynthia sat on the couch with her laptop open, though she hadn't read the same paragraph in nearly 10 minutes. Gerald walked inside. Hey. He put his keys on the small table near the door. You're still up. I had some work to finish. He nodded. How was your day? Busy. Mine too. He loosened his collar. Cynthia looked at him. She had spent most of the day telling herself that she wasn't going to ask about the receipt. She had made a decision that morning. She would not accuse him based on one piece of paper. She would not search through his belongings. She would not start following him. She would not become someone she didn't recognize. But she had also spent the day thinking about something else. Gerald had been changing. The receipt hadn't created that feeling. It had simply given the feeling a shape. He walked into the kitchen. You eat? Yes. What's in there? Chicken. He opened the refrigerator. Want some? No. He looked back at her. You sure? Yeah. Gerald took out a bottle of water. He closed the refrigerator. For a few seconds he stood there. Cynthia watched him. There was a question sitting inside her. She could have asked about the restaurant. Instead, she asked something much harder. Gerald, yeah? Are you happy? He stopped. What? Are you happy? He looked at her as though he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Where did that come from? I don't know. Gerald walked back into the living room. He remained standing. Why are you asking me that? Cynthia closed her laptop. Because I want to know. He looked at her. Am I supposed to say no? No. Then what are you asking? She took a breath. I'm asking whether you're happy with your life. Gerald sat in the chair across from her. He rubbed his hands together. For a few moments neither spoke. Finally he said, Yeah. Cynthia studied his face. The answer had come too quickly. "You're sure?" "Yes," she nodded. "Okay." Gerald frowned. "Why don't I feel like you believe me?" Cynthia looked down. "I didn't say I didn't. You didn't have to." She was quiet. Gerald leaned forward. "Are you unhappy?" Cynthia hesitated. "A little." His expression changed. "Why?" "I don't know." He gave a short breath. "You just asked me if I'm happy, and now you're telling me you're unhappy." "I said a little." "What does that mean?" Cynthia looked at him. "It means I don't feel like we're as close as we used to be." Gerald leaned back. "We've been married 2 years." "I know. Things change. I know. You can't expect everything to feel like the first few months." "I don't." "Then what are we talking about?" Cynthia looked at him. "I miss talking to you." Gerald's expression softened slightly. "We talk. About bills. We talk about work. Sometimes. What's missing?" Cynthia looked down at her hands. "I don't know how to explain it." "Try." She took a breath. "I feel like you're here, but you're somewhere else." Gerald's jaw tightened. "That's not fair. I'm not trying to be unfair. It sounds like you are. I'm telling you how I feel." He looked away. Cynthia watched him. For a moment she considered mentioning the receipt. She could have said, "I found something in your bag." She could have asked him about the restaurant. She could have asked who he was with. Instead, she stayed quiet. Something about the conversation made her realize that the receipt wasn't the real question. The real question was whether Gerald would tell her that something was wrong without being forced. She waited. He didn't. Gerald finally said, "I've been stressed. About work, money, everything." Cynthia nodded. "You could have told me." "I didn't want to bring it home. You live here. I know. I'm your wife. I know that too." She looked at him. "Then why do I feel like I'm the last person you talk to?" Gerald's eyes moved away. He didn't answer. Cynthia noticed. She had been waiting for an explanation. What she saw instead was hesitation, not enough to prove anything, enough to hurt. She stood. "I don't want to fight." "I'm not trying to fight. I know." "Then what do you want?" She turned toward him. "Talk to me." "I am talking." "No." She shook her head. "You're answering questions." Gerald stared at her. "What's the difference?" "The difference is that I shouldn't have to keep asking questions to find out what's happening with my husband." He looked frustrated. "What exactly do you think is happening?" Cynthia's heart beat faster. She had an opening. This was the moment. She could ask him. She could say the words. "Are you seeing someone?" But she didn't. Not yet. "I don't know," she said. Gerald shook his head. "You keep saying that." "Because I don't know." "Then what am I supposed to do?" "Be honest with me." "I am." Cynthia looked at him. Neither of them spoke. She wanted to believe him. That was the painful part. She wanted his answer to be enough. She wanted to go back to the version of herself who could hear "I'm fine" and accept it without wondering what lived underneath those words. Instead, she said quietly, "Okay." Gerald stood. "That's it? For tonight?" He looked at her. "Cynthia." "I'm tired." She walked toward the bedroom. Behind her, Gerald remained in the living room. She could feel his eyes following her. She closed the bedroom door. Not hard, not dramatically. She simply needed a few minutes alone. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her heart was beating quickly. She hadn't asked the question. She knew that. But she also knew something had happened. She had told Gerald she was lonely. She had told him she felt him slipping away. She had asked whether he was happy. He had said yes. But he had not asked what he could do to make their marriage better. He had not told her what was really bothering him. He had defended himself. That distinction stayed with her. Later that night, Gerald came into the bedroom. Cynthia was already lying down. He changed in silence. He got into bed. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Gerald said, "I'm sorry." Cynthia looked at the ceiling. "For what?" "For making you feel like that." She turned toward him. "Like what?" "Alone." The word surprised her. Gerald rarely used it. She looked at him. "Do you feel alone?" He stared at the ceiling. "Sometimes." Cynthia swallowed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I don't know." There it was again. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because she had begun to realize how often Gerald used those 3 words whenever a conversation got close to something uncomfortable. "I wish you would talk to me before things get bad," she said. "I'll try." She nodded. "Okay." He reached for her hand. She let him hold it. For a few minutes they lay there quietly. Cynthia wanted to believe the conversation had changed something. Maybe it had. Maybe Gerald had finally understood what she was saying. She closed her eyes. His hand remained around hers. It was warm, familiar. She loved him. That hadn't changed. The problem was that love made uncertainty harder to carry. The following Thursday arrived without either of them mentioning it. Gerald left work earlier than usual. At 6:15, he came into the bedroom wearing a new shirt. Cynthia was putting away laundry. She looked at him. New shirt? Yeah. When did you get that? A few days ago. She folded a towel. Nice. Thanks. He stood in front of the mirror. He adjusted his collar. Then he reached for a bottle of cologne. Cynthia watched him spray it. She recognized the scent. She had bought it for him the previous Christmas. Gerald usually wore it on special occasions. She smiled faintly. You haven't worn that in a while. He looked at his reflection. Thought I'd use it. Going somewhere? Just dinner? With clients? Yeah. He picked up his watch. Cynthia watched him fasten it. She had the restaurant receipt in the back of her mind. She didn't mention it. Gerald looked at her. What? Nothing. He smiled. You're quiet. So are you. He laughed softly. Fair. He walked over. He kissed her cheek. I'll see you later. Cynthia looked at him. Okay. He left. She listened to his footsteps move across the apartment. The front door opened, closed. His car started. The sound faded down the street. Cynthia remained standing beside the laundry basket. Something inside her had shifted. A few weeks earlier, she would have spent the evening wondering whether Gerald would be home early enough for dinner. Now she was wondering where he would actually be. She went into the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator, closed it, opened a cabinet, closed it. She wasn't hungry. She picked up her phone. For a moment she considered calling Gerald. She didn't. Instead, she opened the calendar. She looked at the previous Thursdays. She counted them. There were more than she had realized. She began writing the dates down. Not because she wanted to build a case against him. She wanted to understand what was happening. She opened their banking app. The restaurant charge appeared again. Same restaurant. Another Thursday. Cynthia stared at the screen. Her first reaction wasn't anger. It was disappointment. She had wanted the conversation they had shared earlier in the week to mean something. She had hoped Gerald had heard her. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. Either way, he had left the house wearing the cologne she had bought him, carrying his phone, and heading toward another Thursday evening he had not explained. Cynthia put the phone down. She sat at the kitchen table. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility she had been avoiding. Maybe there was another woman. The thought made her stomach tighten. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't want the words to become real. She thought about the receipt, the changed password, the private phone calls, the Thursday dinners, the distance, the way Gerald sometimes seemed more careful about his appearance before leaving than he had been when they went out together. One thing connected all of it. Thursday. Cynthia leaned back in her chair. She could accuse him now. She had enough to ask a serious question. But she didn't want to walk into that conversation with assumptions and anger. If she asked Gerald whether he was seeing someone, she wanted to be ready for whatever answer came back. Yes, no, a lie. She wasn't sure which frightened her most. She opened the notes app on her phone. She typed, "What I know." She paused. Underneath it she wrote, "Gerald has been distant." Then, his phone password changed. Then, he has recurring Thursday dinners. Then, there are restaurant charges. She stared at the list. She added one more sentence. "I don't know who he is meeting." She stopped there. She didn't add an accusation. She didn't write Zoe's name. She didn't have a name. Not yet. Cynthia placed the phone beside her. She thought about the conversation they had shared. She thought about Gerald telling her he was unhappy. She thought about herself admitting that she was lonely. Maybe the marriage really was struggling. Maybe Gerald was dealing with something he hadn't learned how to explain. Maybe the restaurant was exactly what he said it was. But Cynthia knew she couldn't keep using possibilities to silence what she was actually seeing. She wasn't going to accuse Gerald without knowing the truth. She wasn't going to search through his phone. She wasn't going to follow him. She wasn't going to create a story in her head and punish him for something she couldn't prove. But she also wasn't going to keep lying to herself. That was the first decision Cynthia made without telling Gerald. She would pay attention. She would learn the truth. And whatever she discovered, she would deal with it honestly. Across Birmingham, Gerald was driving toward another Thursday dinner. He believed the biggest problem in his marriage was that Cynthia no longer understood him. He had not yet admitted that he had stopped giving her the chance to. The Thursday pattern did not stop after Cynthia decided to pay attention. If anything, it became easier to see. Gerald still left the house with ordinary explanations. Work, a client, dinner, a property issue, A meeting that had run late. None of the explanations sounded impossible. That was what made them difficult to challenge. Cynthia had spent enough time around Gerald to know that his job really could interrupt his evenings. She had seen him answer calls about leaking roofs, angry tenants, delayed contractors, and owners who expected problems to disappear simply because they had called him. She did not want to turn his occupation into evidence against him. But she began noticing other things. Gerald started paying more attention to what he wore on Thursdays. It wasn't obvious at first. He might change his shirt before leaving work. He might spend an extra few minutes in front of the bathroom mirror. He started using the cologne Cynthia had given him more often. Once he changed his shoes before leaving the house. Cynthia was sitting at the kitchen table when he walked back into the bedroom. "You changed your shoes." Gerald looked down. "These are more comfortable." She smiled. "Since when?" "Since today," he said it casually. Cynthia nodded. "Okay." She returned to her coffee. She wasn't trying to catch him. She was observing. There was a difference. Still, every new detail made something inside her tighten. A week later, Gerald came home from work carrying groceries. Cynthia was standing at the stove. He placed the bags on the counter. "I got the things you like." She looked inside. Strawberries, her favorite yogurt, the coffee she preferred. She looked at him. "You went shopping?" "Yeah. Why?" "Because we needed food." She smiled. "We have food. We're almost out." Cynthia looked at the bags. He was right. They were almost out of several things. She reached for the strawberries. "Thank you." Gerald leaned against the counter. "You're welcome." He watched her for a moment. "You okay?" Cynthia looked at him. "Yeah." "You seem quiet. I've been tired." He walked closer. "Come here." She looked at him. "What?" "Come here." He opened his arms. Cynthia stepped toward him. Gerald hugged her. His arms felt familiar. The scent of his cologne was faint. She rested her cheek against his chest. For a few seconds she let herself relax. She wanted to stay there. She wanted the suspicion to disappear. She wanted the marriage she remembered to still be the marriage she was living. Gerald kissed the top of her head. "I love you." Cynthia closed her eyes. "I love you too." She meant it. That was what made everything so painful. A person could love someone deeply and still be unable to trust what that person was doing. Cynthia pulled away. Gerald touched her cheek. "You sure you're okay?" "Yeah, good." He smiled. She smiled back. He picked up one of the grocery bags. "I got something for dinner." "What?" "Steak." She laughed. "Since when do you cook steak?" "I can cook steak. You almost burned it last time." "That was one time. That was 3 times." Gerald laughed. For several minutes the kitchen felt like their old kitchen again. They talked. They teased each other. He opened the refrigerator. She started preparing the vegetables. Nothing about the evening looked broken. That was becoming one of the hardest parts for Cynthia to understand. How could Gerald be affectionate with her if he was hiding something? How could he tell her he loved her and mean it while possibly giving another woman a version of himself that belonged inside their marriage? She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure there was one. Later that night, Gerald fell asleep beside her. Cynthia lay awake. She looked at him. His face was relaxed. He looked younger when he slept. She remembered the first apartment they had shared. She remembered the cheap dining table they had bought because they couldn't afford the nicer one. She remembered Gerald assembling it incorrectly and insisting the instructions were wrong. She remembered laughing until her stomach hurt. Those memories were real. Her love for him was real. The problem was that neither of those things answered the question she had been carrying. Was Gerald still being honest with her? The following morning, Cynthia checked their joint bank account. She had not planned to. She was paying a bill. The account was already open. She glanced through the recent transactions. Most were ordinary. Groceries, gas, utilities, a pharmacy, a restaurant. She stopped. She looked at the restaurant charge. Same restaurant. She checked the date. Thursday. Her stomach tightened. The amount matched the receipt she had found. Cynthia sat back in her chair. She opened the previous month's transactions. Another restaurant charge. Same place. Thursday. She stared at the screen. The receipt had not been a random business meal. The account confirmed it. There had been another dinner. And another. Cynthia put her hand over her mouth. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She was trying to think. Gerald had access to the account. So did she. The charges weren't hidden. He hadn't gone out of his way to conceal them financially. That made the situation more confusing. Maybe the dinners really were business meetings. Maybe he had simply eaten there several times. But the dates were consistently Thursdays. And the amounts were not what Cynthia remembered Gerald spending on ordinary work meals. She wrote the dates down. She looked at them side by side. Thursday, Thursday, Thursday. She closed the banking app. Her first instinct was to confront him. Her second was to wait. She chose neither. Instead, she went to work. Cynthia spent the morning doing what she normally did. She answered emails. She reviewed schedules. She spoke with a coworker about a missing document. She joined a meeting. She smiled when somebody made a joke. Nobody looking at her would have known she was carrying a question that had become heavier during the drive to work. At lunch, she sat alone. Her phone was beside her. She opened her messages. Gerald had sent her a picture of a property issue. She looked at it. A damaged section of a wall. She replied, "That looks expensive." His response came a few minutes later, "Probably." She smiled despite herself. That was Gerald. Even while she was questioning his honesty, she could still recognize his ordinary way of speaking. She put the phone down. Her thoughts returned to the restaurant. She didn't want to become obsessed. She needed somewhere to put what she was feeling. That evening after work, Cynthia sat in her car before going inside. She had made an appointment with a counselor. Not because she had decided Gerald was cheating. She wasn't ready to say that. She had told the counselor only that she felt lonely inside her marriage and didn't understand why. The appointment was the following week. Cynthia almost canceled it twice. She didn't. When she arrived, she sat across from the counselor and kept her purse beside her chair. The room was quiet. The counselor looked at her. "What made you decide to come?" Cynthia took a breath. "I don't know how to talk about my marriage anymore. What happens when you try? I don't think my husband understands what I'm saying." "What are you trying to tell him?" Cynthia looked down. "That I miss him." She paused. "He's there. We live together. We eat together. We talk. But I feel like I'm missing him." The counselor nodded. Cynthia continued, "I don't want to be dramatic. You don't sound dramatic. I don't want to accuse him of something I can't prove. Have you accused him of something? No. Do you suspect something?" Cynthia was quiet. A little. The counselor didn't press. Cynthia appreciated that. "I found some restaurant charges," she said. "Do you know what they were for?" "No." "Have you asked him?" "No." "Why not?" Cynthia thought about it. "Because if I ask, I have to be ready for the answer." The counselor nodded. "That's understandable." Cynthia looked up. "I keep thinking maybe I'm making something out of nothing." "Maybe." The answer surprised her. The counselor continued. "And maybe you're noticing something important." Cynthia sat quietly. "What matters right now isn't proving what Gerald is doing. What matters is understanding what has happened to your ability to trust." Cynthia looked at her. "I don't trust him?" "I'm asking you." Cynthia swallowed. "I don't know." The counselor leaned forward slightly. "Trust doesn't disappear only after you catch someone doing something. Sometimes it weakens when their behavior stops making sense to you." Cynthia looked down at her hands. That sentence stayed with her. She had been waiting for proof before giving herself permission to acknowledge the problem. Maybe she didn't need proof to admit that she was struggling. She didn't need proof to say she felt lonely. She didn't need proof to recognize that she had begun watching Gerald instead of simply living beside him. The counselor asked, "What would make you feel more secure?" Cynthia thought for a long moment. "Honesty. From Gerald? Yes. And from yourself?" Cynthia looked up. The question caught her. "What do you mean? Are you being honest with yourself about what you're seeing?" Cynthia didn't answer immediately. Finally, she nodded. "I think I've been trying not to know." The counselor said nothing. Cynthia looked toward the window. She realized that was probably the most honest sentence she had spoken since the questions began. She had been hoping the signs would disappear. She had been hoping Gerald would become more open on his own. She had been hoping affection would prove that her fears were wrong. But affection was not proof. Neither was a quiet home. Neither was a shared bank account. Neither was the fact that Gerald still told her he loved her. Love could exist alongside dishonesty. That realization hurt. Cynthia wiped at the corner of her eye before any tears could fall. "I don't want to lose my marriage." The counselor nodded. "You don't have to decide that today." Cynthia looked up. "Then what do I decide?" "Start with what you need to know." Cynthia sat with that. What did she need to know? Not everything. Not yet. She needed to understand her own life. Their finances, their shared responsibilities. What belonged to both of them. What belonged only to Gerald. What she had stopped paying attention to because she trusted him to handle it. That evening, Cynthia went home. Gerald was already there. He had bought groceries again. He was standing in the kitchen opening a bag. "You hungry?" She looked at him. "Not really." He walked over. "How was your day?" "Fine." He kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes for a moment. She still loved him. That hadn't disappeared. But something had changed inside her. She no longer believed that love required her to look away. After Gerald went to bed, Cynthia sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. She opened the bank account. This time she wasn't looking for Gerald's Thursday dinners. She was looking at her own life. The bills, the savings, the automatic payments, the shared account. The accounts she rarely checked because Gerald usually handled the financial details. She began writing down what she knew. Not accusations, not theories, facts. She needed to understand where she stood, because whatever the truth about Gerald's Thursday evenings turned out to be, Cynthia realized she could not afford to be unfamiliar with her own financial life. She had trusted her husband. Now she needed to make sure she still understood the life they had built together. Cynthia did not tell Gerald what she had done with the bank statements, not because she was trying to hide something from him. She simply wasn't ready to explain why she had started paying attention to parts of their life she had once left entirely in his hands. Over the next few days, she went through their regular expenses: rent, utilities, insurance, car payments, savings, credit cards. Nothing immediately looked alarming. There was no large unexplained withdrawal, no strange transfer that gave her an obvious answer. The more she looked, the more ordinary their finances appeared. That should have made her feel better. Instead, it reminded her of something she hadn't wanted to admit. She knew Gerald well enough to trust him. She did not know their finances well enough to understand them without him. That distinction mattered. On Saturday morning, Gerald was sitting at the kitchen table paying a bill when Cynthia walked in. He looked up. "Morning." "Morning." He pushed a mug toward her. "I made coffee." She took it. "Thank you." Gerald went back to the computer. Cynthia stood there for a moment. "What are you working on?" "Insurance. For the car?" "Yeah." She nodded. "Do you mind if I look at the account sometime?" Gerald glanced up. "Which account?" "The joint one." He looked confused. "Why?" "I want to understand it better." "Sure." There was no defensiveness in his voice. That almost made Cynthia feel guilty. "Okay," Gerald smiled. "You know you can look at it any time." "I know." He returned to the computer. Cynthia walked away. She didn't tell him that she had already been looking. She also didn't tell him why. That afternoon, Gerald suggested they go grocery shopping together. They walked through the store with a cart between them. Gerald picked up cereal. Cynthia put it back. "You don't eat that." "I do. You did once." He laughed. "Okay, fair." They moved to the produce section. He reached for strawberries. "These?" She smiled. "Those are mine." "I know." He put them into the cart. Cynthia looked at him. There were moments like this that made her question herself. Gerald remembered small things. He knew what she liked. He knew which yogurt she preferred. He knew she hated overly ripe bananas. He knew which coffee she bought when she wanted to treat herself. He wasn't emotionally absent every second of every day. That was what made her situation difficult. People were not always one thing. A person could be loving in one moment and dishonest in another. Cynthia was beginning to understand that. They finished shopping. Gerald carried the bags to the car. On the drive home, he reached over and placed his hand on Cynthia's knee. She looked at him. "What?" "Nothing." He smiled. She smiled back. She didn't pull his hand away, but she didn't let herself use the moment as evidence either. She was learning to separate what she felt from what she knew. That night, Gerald fell asleep on the couch. Cynthia covered him with a blanket. She stood there looking down at him. She thought about how easy it would be to believe everything was fine if she stopped asking questions. She could do that. She had done it before, but she didn't want to anymore. Thursday came again. Gerald mentioned his dinner while putting on his shoes. "Going to be late." Cynthia was standing near the kitchen counter. "Where are you going?" "Downtown." "Business dinner?" "Yeah." She nodded. "What time will you be back?" "Probably around 10. "Okay." Gerald looked at her. "You don't have to wait up." "I know." He smiled. "I'll see you later." He kissed her cheek. Then he left. Cynthia watched the door close. She didn't immediately sit down. She walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, closed it. She wasn't hungry. Her phone was on the counter. She knew another restaurant charge would probably appear. She hated knowing that. At 8:17, her phone vibrated. Cynthia looked at the screen. A banking notification. She opened it. Restaurant. Same place. Her chest tightened. She stared at the charge. For several seconds, she did nothing. Then she called her counselor. The call went to voicemail. Cynthia hung up. She stared at the phone. A minute later, she called again. This time, the counselor answered. "Hi, Cynthia." "Hi. Are you okay?" "I don't know. What's happening?" Another charge came through. There was a short pause. "The restaurant?" "Yes." "Did Gerald tell you he was going there?" "He said he had a business dinner downtown." "Did you ask him who he was meeting?" "No." "Why?" Cynthia looked toward the front door. Because I'm waiting for him to make a mistake. Her voice sounded strange to her. The counselor remained quiet. Cynthia continued. I keep thinking if I just wait, he'll do something obvious, something I can't explain away. How does waiting make you feel? Tired? And afraid? Yes. Why do you feel guilty asking him? Cynthia leaned against the counter. I don't want to be the suspicious wife. Are you asking him a reasonable question? I don't know. You know there is a difference between accusing someone and asking for honesty. Cynthia closed her eyes. I know. You don't need permission to ask your husband where he goes every Thursday. Cynthia took a slow breath. You're right. Whatever answer he gives you, you'll deal with it. Cynthia looked at the clock. 9:36. I think I need to ask him tonight. Then ask. Without mentioning the charge, ask what you actually want to know. Cynthia thought about that. She didn't want to say, I saw another restaurant charge. That would turn the conversation into an argument about money. She wanted to know where he had been, who he had been with, whether he could look at her and tell her the truth. Okay, take care of yourself tonight. I will. They ended the call. Cynthia placed her phone on the counter. She sat at the kitchen table. She waited. At 10:11 she heard Gerald's car. Her heart began beating faster. She hated that. She had been married to him for 2 years. She shouldn't feel nervous when she heard his key in the door. Gerald walked inside. Hey, he put his keys down. You still up? Yes. He loosened his collar. Long night. Cynthia looked at him. Where were you? He stopped. The question was simple. Gerald stared at her. Downtown. Where downtown? He hesitated. At a restaurant. Cynthia waited. What restaurant? Gerald looked away. The usual place. Cynthia's heart sank. The usual place. Yeah, which place? He rubbed the back of his neck. Cynthia, I'm tired. I just asked where you were. I told you. At a restaurant. Yes. Which one? Gerald's expression tightened. Why does this matter? Cynthia looked at him. Because I'm your wife. He stared at her. I told you it was a business dinner. Who were you with? There was a pause. Gerald looked at the floor. A client. What client? He sighed. Why are you interrogating me? Cynthia felt something inside her go quiet. She had expected anger. She had expected him to laugh. She had expected an easy explanation. Instead, he was irritated. That told her something. Not enough to answer every question. Enough to make her stop asking them tonight. She nodded. Okay. Gerald looked at her. Okay? Yes. That's it? I'm tired. He stared at her. Cynthia, no. She stood. I'm not doing this tonight. Doing what? Trying to get an answer from someone who doesn't want to give one. Gerald's face hardened. I'm telling you the truth. She looked at him. For a moment she wanted to challenge him. She wanted to tell him about the banking notification. She wanted to put the restaurant charge on the table. She wanted to ask why a business dinner required so much secrecy. Instead, she simply said, Good night, Gerald. She walked toward the bedroom. Behind her, Gerald remained in the kitchen. He didn't follow. Cynthia closed the bedroom door. She leaned against it. Her heart was beating hard. She had not shouted. She had not accused him. She had not cried. But she felt something different. For weeks she had been trying to understand Gerald. She had been searching for explanations. She had been studying his behavior. She had been waiting for him to make the truth easier for her to accept. That night she stopped. She didn't know exactly what Gerald was hiding, but she knew he had refused to answer a simple question honestly, and that was enough for tonight. Cynthia changed into her pajamas. She washed her face. She got into bed. Gerald came in much later. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The following morning he behaved as though the conversation had never happened. He kissed her cheek before leaving. I'll see you tonight. Cynthia looked at him. Okay. The door closed. She sat at the kitchen table. Her coffee grew cold. She opened the notes on her phone. At the top she still had 3 headings. What I know, what I don't know, what I need to ask. She looked at the first list, the second, then the third. For the first time she understood something important. She did not need to chase Gerald from question to question. She did not need to force him into admitting something he was determined to conceal. If he was lying, his lies would eventually have consequences. Her responsibility was not to catch him. Her responsibility was to decide what she would do once she knew enough. Cynthia closed the notes. She went to work. That evening Gerald called her on his way home. Hey, I was thinking about last night. Cynthia waited. I shouldn't have gotten defensive. She was quiet. I was tired. I know. I didn't mean to make you feel like I was hiding something. Cynthia looked out the window of her office. Okay, are we good? She thought about the question. I don't know. There was silence on the line. Then Gerald said, okay. They ended the call. Cynthia placed her phone down. She didn't feel relieved, but she didn't feel desperate anymore. She had spent weeks trying to get Gerald to explain himself. Now she was going to stop chasing explanations. She would pay attention, she would protect her own stability, and she would let Gerald's choices tell her what his words would not. Gerald's relationship with Zoe had not started with a kiss. That was one of the things he told himself whenever guilt became difficult to ignore. There had been no single morning when he woke up and decided to betray Cynthia. It began much more quietly. A conversation, then another, a little attention he enjoyed receiving, a complaint he should have taken home to his wife instead of sharing with another woman. Zoe worked in the same commercial property circle as Gerald, though not directly under him. Their professional paths crossed often enough that speaking to each other never seemed unusual. The first time Gerald stayed behind after a meeting to talk with her, the subject was work. A tenant had been giving him trouble. Gerald was frustrated. Zoe listened. You sound exhausted, she said. Gerald laughed. You have no idea. Bad week, bad few months. She looked at him. That bad? Gerald hesitated. He should have stopped there. Instead, he started talking about Cynthia. Not in cruel terms, not at first. He said they had become distant. He said Cynthia was always busy. He said they barely talked anymore. He said he sometimes felt as though they were living beside each other instead of with each other. Zoe listened. She didn't interrupt. That mattered to Gerald. At home, conversations with Cynthia had started to feel difficult because Cynthia wanted answers. Zoe didn't ask him to explain himself. She simply listened. Gerald liked that. He liked how easy it felt. He liked leaving a conversation with her feeling understood. What he failed to recognize was that he was creating emotional intimacy outside his marriage while telling himself he was merely talking. The conversations continued. Sometimes they were about work, sometimes they weren't. Zoe began asking questions about his life. What do you do when you're not working? Gerald smiled. Not much. That sounds depressing. It probably is. What about your wife? Gerald became quieter. What about her? Do you two do anything together? Sometimes. Sometimes. Gerald shrugged. Things have changed. Zoe looked at him. How? He told her. Not everything. Not the parts that made him responsible. He told her about the loneliness. He told her about the arguments that had become silence. He told her Cynthia seemed distracted. He told her he wasn't sure they were right for each other anymore. He did not tell Zoe about the nights Cynthia waited for him. He did not tell her about the meals she saved. He did not tell her about the grocery lists. He did not tell her about the way Cynthia still asked whether he had eaten. He gave Zoe the version of his marriage that made his own choices easier to defend. Zoe didn't know Cynthia. She only knew what Gerald told her. That was enough for her to develop an opinion. You sound unhappy. I am. Have you told your wife? Gerald looked away. Not properly. Why not? I don't know. Zoe shook her head. If you're that unhappy, you should do something. Gerald nodded. I know. But knowing and acting were different things. The first time they went for coffee outside work, Gerald told himself it wasn't a date. They talked for nearly 2 hours. When he returned home, Cynthia was sitting on the couch. How was work? Fine. Did you eat? Yeah. She nodded. Gerald kissed her forehead. Cynthia smiled. He felt guilty. That guilt should have stopped him. Instead, he told himself that the coffee had meant nothing. The next week, he met Zoe again. The conversations became more personal. Eventually, Gerald crossed a line. He knew when it happened. There was no confusion about it. Yet even after that, he continued telling himself the same story. His marriage had been struggling. He was lonely. Zoe understood him. He had not planned for any of this. Those explanations helped him sleep. They did not make his behavior less dishonest. Zoe knew Gerald was married. She had never been under the impression that he was single. That was part of the complication between them. She wanted him to make a decision. Gerald kept asking for time. One evening, Zoe sat across from him at a small cafe. "You keep saying you're going to figure things out." "I am." "When?" "I don't know." She looked at him. "That's becoming your answer to everything." Gerald sighed. "I need time." "You've had time." "I know." "Then what are you waiting for?" Gerald didn't answer. Zoe folded her arms. "Does Cynthia know about me?" "No." "Does she know you're unhappy? She knows we're having problems." "That's not what I asked." Gerald looked at the table. "No." Zoe shook her head. "I don't want to spend another year waiting for a man to decide whether he wants to leave his wife." Gerald looked at her. "I don't expect you to wait forever. But you keep asking me to wait. I'll figure it out." Zoe stared at him. "That's what you said last month." Gerald rubbed his forehead. "I know." She softened slightly. "I care about you. I care about you too. Then stop making me feel like I'm somebody you're fitting into the empty spaces in your life." Gerald looked at her. He knew she was right, but he still wasn't ready to make the decision she wanted. That was the pattern Gerald had created. Whenever honesty demanded a difficult choice, he asked for more time. Whenever Cynthia sensed distance, he called it stress. Whenever Zoe asked about the future, he promised he would figure it out. He kept both women waiting for different reasons. One was waiting for honesty. The other was waiting for commitment. Gerald was waiting for a version of his life where he wouldn't have to disappoint either of them. That version did not exist. Several weeks later, Gerald stopped at a jewelry store after work. He had no clear reason for going inside. He walked past several displays before noticing a simple bracelet. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't something that would attract attention from across a room. He imagined Zoe wearing it. He bought it. On the drive home, he felt both excited and uncomfortable. He hid the box in the glove compartment. He planned to give it to Zoe the following Thursday. When he arrived home, Cynthia was in the bedroom folding laundry. "You're home early." "Yeah." She looked at him. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine." He put his keys down. The small jewelry box was still in his jacket pocket. Cynthia continued folding clothes. Gerald walked into the bathroom. He took off his jacket and placed it over the edge of the hamper. The box slipped from the pocket. It landed on the floor. Cynthia heard the sound. She looked over. "What was that?" Gerald came out quickly. "Nothing." He picked up the box. Cynthia stared at it. "What's that?" Gerald froze. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he said, "Something for work." Cynthia looked at the box. "For work?" "Yeah." She waited. "Who is it for?" Gerald's answer came quickly. "A client." Cynthia studied him. "A bracelet? It's a thank you gift." She nodded slowly. "Okay." Gerald tucked the box into his pocket. Cynthia returned to the laundry. She didn't ask another question. Gerald walked away. He had lied again. This time, the lie had been immediate. Cynthia hadn't needed to investigate. She had watched it happen. That night after Gerald went to bed, Cynthia sat alone at the kitchen table. She thought about the jewelry box. She could have asked to see it. She could have demanded an explanation. She could have searched his things. She didn't. She had learned enough about herself to know that she didn't want to become consumed by the search. She opened the notebook she had started keeping. At the top of the first page she wrote, "What I know." Underneath it, "Gerald has repeated Thursday dinners. There are restaurant charges. He has become protective of his phone. He changed his password. He bought a bracelet and told me it was for a client." She stopped. Then she turned the page. "What I don't know," she wrote. "Who he meets, what the dinners are really about, whether there is another woman, how long this has been happening." She turned another page. "What I need to ask." Her pen remained still for several seconds. Finally she wrote, "Is Gerald being honest with me?" Cynthia stared at the sentence. That was the real question. Not whether he loved her, not whether he still hugged her, not whether he bought groceries, not whether he occasionally made her laugh. She needed to know whether she could trust the words coming out of his mouth. She closed the notebook. Across the apartment, Gerald was lying awake. He was thinking about Zoe. He wanted to give her the bracelet. He wanted her to believe he was serious. He also knew Cynthia had noticed the box. He told himself it hadn't mattered. She hadn't asked enough questions. She hadn't accused him. He could still keep everything under control. That belief lasted only until Thursday morning. Gerald stood in front of the bedroom mirror. He selected a clean shirt. He shaved carefully. He used the cologne Cynthia had bought him. Cynthia was sitting on the edge of the bed. She watched him. Going somewhere? Yeah. Work dinner? Yes. She nodded. Gerald picked up his watch. He looked at himself in the mirror. He had already decided what he wanted to do. He wanted to take Zoe somewhere nicer, somewhere quiet, somewhere that felt important. He wanted to make her believe that his promises were real. He opened his phone and confirmed the reservation. The restaurant name appeared on the screen. Gerald looked at it for a moment. He had been there before, almost 2 years earlier, with Cynthia. It had been one of their first special dinners after getting married. She had worn a dress he loved. He remembered laughing with her. He remembered reaching across the table and holding her hand. He remembered telling her that he hoped they would still be celebrating birthdays and anniversaries together years later. The memory lasted only a few seconds. Gerald pushed it away. He had chosen the restaurant because it was elegant and discreet. He didn't think about Cynthia when he made the reservation. He thought about Zoe. That was the irony. The place he believed would help him begin a new chapter was tied to one of the happiest memories of his marriage. He put his phone away. Cynthia looked at him. Have a good night. Gerald turned toward her. You too. He kissed her cheek. She let him. He picked up his keys and walked toward the door. Cynthia listened as it closed. She didn't know exactly where he was going, but she had learned enough to know that Thursday was no longer just another evening. Gerald was driving toward the restaurant. Zoe was waiting for him. Cynthia was sitting at home with her notebook. 3 people were about to enter the same story from very different places. Gerald believed he was finally taking control of his future. Zoe believed Gerald was finally ready to choose her. Cynthia, for the first time, had stopped trying to force the truth out of him. She was simply watching what he chose to do, and Gerald had just chosen a restaurant that carried a memory he had forgotten mattered. Gerald stood in front of the bedroom mirror longer than he needed to. The shirt was already buttoned. His shoes were already polished. His watch was fastened around his wrist. There was no practical reason to keep adjusting his collar. Still, he did. He turned slightly toward the mirror. The dark shirt fit well across his shoulders. He had chosen it deliberately. Not too formal, not too casual. The cologne was the part that made him pause. Cynthia had given it to him the previous Christmas. He remembered opening the box at their kitchen table. She had smiled when he pulled the bottle out.
You said you liked this one.
I did. I remembered. He had kissed her that night. Now he sprayed the same cologne onto his wrist. For a moment he felt uncomfortable. He almost reached for another bottle. He didn't. He looked at himself again. Tonight was supposed to be different. That was what he had been telling himself all week. He wasn't simply meeting Zoe for another dinner. He wanted to talk about the future. He wanted to stop living between 2 versions of his life. He wanted to tell Zoe that he was serious. The problem was that he had been telling himself variations of the same thing for months. This time, however, he had convinced himself that he meant it. Cynthia was in the kitchen when he came out. She was sitting at the table with her laptop open. She looked up. You're leaving? Yeah. Business dinner? Yes. She studied him for a second. Gerald felt his stomach tighten. He wondered whether she could see anything on his face. She didn't say anything. Have a good night, she said. You too. He walked toward her. For a brief second he considered telling her the truth. Not everything. Just enough to stop the lying. He could say there was something wrong. He could say he had been unhappy. He could say he needed to talk. Instead, he kissed her cheek. I'll see you later. Cynthia nodded. Okay. Gerald picked up his keys. He walked out. The door closed behind him. He stood on the porch for a moment before walking toward his car. He felt relief. That relief should have bothered him more than it did. Inside the car, he started the engine. His phone was connected to the dashboard. A message from Zoe was waiting. I'm here, Gerald replied. Leaving now. He placed the phone down. As he drove, he thought about what he would say. He had rehearsed some of it, not word for word. He didn't want to sound rehearsed. He wanted Zoe to believe him. He wanted her to know that tonight mattered. He wanted her to stop asking when he was going to make a decision. Most of all, he wanted to feel like a man who had finally made one. By the time he reached the restaurant, he had almost convinced himself that he was. Zoe was waiting near the entrance. She wore a dark dress and had her hair pulled back. When she saw Gerald, she smiled. You look good. So do you. She stepped closer. You used the cologne. Gerald looked at her. You noticed? I always notice. He smiled. For a moment, the tension of the past few weeks disappeared. They walked inside together. The hostess confirmed the reservation and led them to their table. Gerald pulled out Zoe's chair. She sat. He took the seat opposite her. A waiter brought them menus. They ordered drinks. For several minutes they talked about ordinary things. Work, traffic, a restaurant Zoe had wanted to try. Gerald laughed at something she said. She smiled. The evening looked like a normal date. That was exactly what Gerald wanted. He wanted to forget the complicated parts. He wanted to imagine that his life was simple. Zoe eventually placed her glass on the table. "Can we talk?" Gerald knew what was coming. "Sure. About us." He nodded. "I figured." Zoe looked at him carefully. "I don't want another night where we talk about the future without actually doing anything about it." Gerald leaned back. "I know. You've said that before. I know." "Gerald, I'm serious. So am I." "Then tell me what changes after tonight." Gerald looked down briefly. He'd expected the question. He still wasn't completely prepared for it. "I need to talk to Cynthia." Zoe's expression changed. "When?" "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" "Yes. You're actually going to do it?" Gerald nodded. "Yes." Zoe studied him. "You've said you were going to talk to her before." "I know. So why should I believe you now?" Gerald took a breath. "Because I'm tired." "Tired of what?" "Living like this." Zoe's voice softened. "Like what?" Gerald looked at her. "Like I'm pretending everything is fine when it isn't." She didn't respond. Gerald continued. "I come home and act like I'm okay. I go to work. I tell you I'll figure things out. I keep putting everything off." "Why?" "Because I don't want to hurt anybody." Zoe looked at him. "You're already hurting people." Gerald lowered his eyes. He knew she was right. "I know." She reached across the table. Her fingers touched his hand. "I don't want to be your secret." Gerald turned his hand over and held hers. "You won't be." "When?" "After tonight, things are going to change." Zoe watched him. "Do you mean that?" "Yes." She searched his face. "Really? Yes." He said it without hesitation. For the first time, Zoe allowed herself to believe him. She smiled. Gerald smiled back. Inside his mind, the future began taking shape. He imagined telling Cynthia. He imagined the difficult conversation. He imagined packing some things. He imagined a smaller place at first. He imagined spending more time with Zoe. He imagined weekends without explanations. He imagined waking up without checking his phone before speaking to either woman. He imagined freedom. The images came easily. What he did not imagine was Cynthia's face when she heard the truth. He did not imagine her sitting alone after he left. He did not imagine the night she had waited for him. He did not imagine the financial questions she had begun asking herself. He did not imagine the notebook in which she had started separating what she knew from what she didn't know. He imagined the future he wanted. That was easier. Zoe squeezed his hand. "What are you thinking about?" Gerald smiled. "Tomorrow." She smiled. "Good." They ordered dinner. The conversation became lighter. Zoe asked about a project Gerald was handling. He told her about a difficult property owner. She laughed. He laughed too. For a little while they looked like two people who had nothing complicated between them. But Gerald knew better. His phone sat face down beside his plate. He had turned it over deliberately. He didn't want Cynthia's name appearing on the screen while he was with Zoe. The irony did not escape him. He had spent months telling himself he wanted honesty. Yet even on the night he claimed he was ready to change his life, he was still arranging his surroundings to keep the truth away. Dinner arrived. Zoe tasted hers. "Good, very," she smiled. "I'm glad you chose this place." Gerald looked around the restaurant. "I wanted somewhere nice." "It is." He looked at her. "I wanted tonight to matter." Zoe held his gaze. "It does." Gerald smiled. For a few seconds he believed that. He believed the dinner was the beginning of something. He believed the difficult conversation with Cynthia would happen tomorrow. He believed he could walk out of his marriage, step into another relationship, and somehow make the transition cleaner than the choices that had brought him there. He had not yet understood that decisions made through secrecy rarely become simple merely because someone finally decides to admit them. Zoe took another bite. "Have you thought about what you're going to tell Cynthia?" Gerald nodded. "Some of it. What will you say? That I've been unhappy." Zoe waited. "That we haven't been close for a long time." She looked at him. "Will you tell her about me?" Gerald hesitated. "Yes." "Everything?" He looked down. "I'll tell her enough." Zoe's expression changed. "Enough. I don't want to hurt her more than necessary." Zoe pulled her hand away. "Gerald." "What?" "If you're going to tell her, don't turn it into another version where you protect yourself." He stared at her. "I'm not trying to protect myself." "Then tell the truth." Gerald was quiet. She was right again. He knew that. But knowing something and being prepared to live with its consequences were not the same thing. He looked around the restaurant. Everything felt calm. People were eating. Servers moved between tables. Glasses were being filled. Nobody knew that Gerald was sitting there planning the end of his marriage. Nobody knew he had lied to Cynthia about being there. Nobody knew Zoe was waiting for him to finally choose her. Gerald looked at Zoe. "I'll tell her." "When?" "Tomorrow." She held his gaze. "Promise?" Gerald nodded. "Promise." He reached across the table and took her hand again. He felt certain. He had made his decision. At least that was what he believed. Across town, Cynthia was at home. She had finished dinner hours earlier. Her notebook was closed on the kitchen table. She had no idea exactly where Gerald was. She knew only what he had told her. Business dinner. She had decided not to call, not to check, not to ask. For the first time since the suspicion began, she was allowing Gerald to make his choices without trying to manage the outcome. He had managed everything. He believed the restaurant was private. He believed Cynthia was unaware. He believed Zoe trusted him. He believed tomorrow would bring a difficult conversation followed by a new beginning. He did not know that his carefully separated worlds had already begun moving toward one another. The waiter was approaching their table. Gerald looked up. He assumed the man was coming to ask whether they wanted dessert. Instead, the waiter carried a small envelope in his hand. Gerald's confidence was about to disappear. The waiter stopped beside their table. Gerald looked up. "Can we get the check?" The waiter nodded. "Of course." He did not reach for the menus or turn away. Instead, he placed a small cream-colored envelope beside Gerald's plate. Gerald looked at it. For a moment, he didn't understand. Then the waiter said quietly, "Your wife sent this." Gerald froze. The words seemed to land separately. Your wife sent this. His hand remained beside his plate. Across from him, Zoe looked from the envelope to Gerald. "What?" Gerald didn't answer. The waiter waited politely. Gerald finally looked up. "Are you sure?" "Yes, sir." "My wife?" The waiter nodded. "She asked me to make sure you received it." Gerald's mouth went dry. Zoe leaned forward. "Gerald," he looked at the waiter again. "When did she come here?" "Earlier this afternoon." Gerald stared at him. "She came here?" "Yes." "Did she leave something else?" "No." "Did she say anything?" The waiter shook his head. "Only that the envelope was for you." Gerald looked around the restaurant. The room seemed smaller than it had 5 minutes earlier. He noticed the entrance, the bar, the tables near the windows. He tried to remember whether he had seen Cynthia when he arrived. He hadn't. She had not walked in. She had not confronted him. She had not created a scene. She had simply come earlier, left an envelope, and left. Gerald looked back at the waiter. "Did she give you her name?" The waiter seemed puzzled by the question. "She said she was your wife." Gerald swallowed. "Did she look angry?" The waiter paused. "She seemed calm." That answer unsettled Gerald more than anger would have. He looked at the envelope. His name was not written on it. Neither was Cynthia's. It looked ordinary, small, almost harmless. But Gerald knew better. He reached for it. Zoe watched his hand. "What is that?" Gerald didn't answer. He turned the envelope over. Nothing, no accusation, no explanation, just Cynthia's handwriting on the back. He recognized it immediately. He had seen it on grocery lists, birthday cards, notes beside his lunch, a reminder on the refrigerator. He knew those letters. His fingers tightened around the envelope. Zoe's voice was quieter now. "Gerald." He looked at her. "She knows." Zoe stared at him. "You don't know that." Gerald looked at the envelope again. "She came here. Maybe somebody told her. Who?" Zoe didn't answer. Gerald opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. He pulled it out. His eyes moved across the first line. He stopped. His face changed. Zoe noticed. "What does it say?" Gerald didn't answer. He read the line again. "I wanted to know whether you would tell me the truth before I had to prove it." His breathing became shallow. He continued reading. "I know about the Thursday dinners." A second line followed. "I know enough to stop asking myself whether I'm imagining things." Gerald's hand lowered slightly. There was no accusation about Zoe. No insult. No threat. No demand that he come home immediately. Cynthia hadn't written a paragraph explaining how much she hated him. She hadn't written that their marriage was over. She had simply stated what she knew. Gerald read the final line. "When you come home, I want the truth, not the version that makes this easier for you." Gerald folded the paper. "Nothing." Zoe's eyes narrowed. Don't do that. Do what? Tell me nothing when something is clearly wrong. Gerald put the note back into the envelope. Zoe reached across the table. Let me see it. No. Her hand stopped. Why? Because it's between me and Cynthia. Zoe stared at him. Your wife knows where you are. Gerald said nothing. You told me she didn't know. I said I didn't think she knew. No. Zoe shook her head. You said she had no idea. Gerald looked away. Zoe's voice became firmer. You told me she wasn't paying attention. I thought she wasn't. You told me she didn't know my name. Gerald remained silent. Zoe leaned back. Does she? I don't know. Zoe gave him a long look. Gerald. He rubbed his forehead. I don't know. She looked at the envelope. She came to this restaurant. Yes, she knew you would be here. Apparently, she knew about the Thursday dinners. Gerald nodded. Zoe's expression changed. How long has she known? I don't know. How long have you known she suspected? Gerald didn't answer. Zoe's eyes narrowed. You knew. I suspected she might have noticed something. When? A while ago. How long? Gerald looked down. I don't know. Zoe sat back. The disappointment on her face was different from before. This wasn't simply jealousy. It was realization. She had been listening to Gerald describe his marriage for months. He had told her Cynthia was distant. He had told her Cynthia was absorbed in work. He had told her their marriage had been emotionally empty. He had told her he was essentially living as a single man inside a marriage that no longer worked. Zoe had believed him. Now she was beginning to wonder how much of that story had been true. You made it sound like she didn't care, Zoe said. Gerald looked at her. I never said she didn't care. You said she barely noticed you. I said we were distant. You said you slept on opposite sides of your lives. Gerald looked away. Zoe continued. Now she comes here. Gerald remained quiet. She sends you a note. Still nothing. And she knows about me. Gerald finally looked at her. I didn't tell her. Zoe shook her head. That's not what I'm asking. He knew exactly what she meant. She was asking how Cynthia had learned enough to reach this restaurant. Gerald had no answer. Zoe stood. Gerald looked up. What are you doing? I'm leaving. Zoe, she picked up her purse. You told me tonight was going to be different. It is. She looked at the envelope. It is. Her voice was flat. Just not in the way you promised. Gerald stood. Please. Zoe looked at him. I need to understand something. What? When you told me Cynthia didn't know anything, did you believe that? Gerald hesitated. Yes. Or did you tell me that because it was easier? He had no answer. Zoe nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Gerald reached for her hand. She pulled it away. Don't. I'm sorry. Are you sorry because she knows? No. Then why? Gerald looked at her. Because I've made this worse. For who? He didn't answer. Zoe looked toward the entrance. If you go home tonight, what are you going to tell her? The truth. She gave a small, humorless laugh. You've been promising truth to everybody. Gerald's face tightened. I mean it. Then don't go home with another prepared speech. What do you want me to do? Tell her what actually happened. Gerald stared at her. Zoe continued. You don't get to spend months telling me one version of your marriage, tell Cynthia another version, and then decide tonight that you can control how everybody reacts. Gerald sat back down. The restaurant suddenly felt different. He could no longer see himself as the man directing the evening. He was reacting. For months he had chosen when to call Zoe, when to go home, when to talk, when to avoid, when to promise. He had controlled the distance between the two worlds. Now Cynthia had entered the situation without physically being there. She had done it with one envelope. Gerald looked down at the note. She had not come to catch him. She had not demanded that he explain himself in public. She had given him a choice, tell the truth, or continue lying after being given the opportunity to stop. Zoe picked up her purse again. I'm going. Gerald looked at her. Can I call you? Not tonight. Zoe, she paused. If you really mean what you've been saying, go home and be honest with your wife. Gerald looked down. And after that? After that, you'll have to live with whatever honesty costs you. She walked away. Gerald remained at the table. The waiter approached quietly. Sir? Gerald looked up. Yes? Would you still like the check? Gerald stared at him. For several seconds he didn't answer. Then he nodded. Yes. The waiter placed the bill on the table. Gerald paid without looking carefully at the amount. He folded Cynthia's note and placed it in his wallet. He stood. The restaurant was still full. People were still eating. Music still played softly in the background. Nothing outside his table had changed. but Gerald's life had. He walked toward the entrance. His phone was in his hand. He opened Cynthia's contact. He thought about calling. He couldn't. Not yet. He needed to go home. Not because he had a plan, because for the first time he understood that Cynthia had already removed his favorite escape. He could no longer pretend she didn't know. He could no longer tell himself he was protecting her by withholding the truth. He could no longer tell Zoe that his marriage was something Cynthia had stopped caring about. Cynthia cared enough to come to the restaurant. She had simply cared enough not to make a scene. Gerald stepped outside. The evening air hit his face. He stood beside his car and looked at the restaurant through the glass. Earlier he had walked inside believing he was beginning a new life. Now he stood outside realizing he might finally have to answer for the old one. He got into his car. Before starting the engine, he looked at the envelope again. Cynthia had not written, "I hate you." She had not written, "We're finished." She had not even written, "Come home now." She had written one thing that frightened him more, "I want the truth." Gerald started the car. He drove home. And for the first time since his affair began, he had no idea what version of the truth he could use to protect himself. Gerald drove home with both hands on the steering wheel. The restaurant was only a short distance away, but the drive felt longer than it should have. Cynthia's note sat in his wallet. He could feel it there without touching it. He had spent months believing that if Cynthia ever discovered the truth, the confrontation would be explosive. He had imagined shouting, questions, accusations, perhaps tears. Instead, she had sent him a piece of paper. That bothered him. It gave her a kind of calm control he hadn't expected. Gerald pulled into the driveway. The apartment was quiet. A light was on in the living room. He sat in the car for several seconds before getting out. Inside, Cynthia was sitting on the couch. She wasn't watching television. Her laptop was closed beside her. The notebook she had been using was nowhere in sight. Gerald closed the door. "You're awake." Cynthia looked at him. "Yes." He put his keys down. Neither of them spoke. Gerald took off his jacket. He had rehearsed conversations during the drive. None of them sounded right anymore. Cynthia looked at him. "How was dinner?" Gerald's throat tightened. "It was fine." She nodded. "Okay." He waited. She didn't ask anything else. That made the room uncomfortable. Gerald walked toward the kitchen. "Cynthia." "Yes?" He stopped. "I got your note." "I know. You came to the restaurant." "Yes." "Why didn't you come inside?" Cynthia looked at him. "Would you have preferred that?" "No, neither would I." Gerald nodded. He understood. She had not wanted a public confrontation. She had wanted him to know she knew. He walked back into the living room. "How long have you known?" Cynthia didn't answer immediately. "Known what?" "About the dinners." She looked at him. "I've noticed them for a while." Gerald sat in the chair opposite her. "Why didn't you ask me?" "I did." He looked confused. "When?" "You may not remember." "I would remember." Cynthia shook her head. "Not every question is asked directly." Gerald looked away. She continued. "I asked whether you were happy." He swallowed. "I remember. You told me you were. I was trying to be honest. Were you?" Gerald looked at her. He had no answer. Cynthia didn't press him. That was what made the silence difficult. She wasn't trying to force him to speak. She was giving him the opportunity. He could have taken it. Instead, Gerald said, "The dinners were complicated." Cynthia's expression barely changed. "That's not an answer." "I know." "Then give me one." Gerald looked at the floor. He could feel the truth sitting inside him. He knew what he had to say. He simply wasn't ready to hear himself say it. Cynthia waited. Finally, Gerald whispered, "There is someone else." Cynthia closed her eyes. The sentence was not a surprise. Still, hearing it aloud changed something. She opened her eyes again. "Who?" Gerald looked at her. "Her name is Zoe." Cynthia nodded once. She had a name now. For weeks she had been living with suspicion. Now she had something concrete. Zoe, the woman behind the Thursday dinners, the woman Gerald had been buying gifts for, the woman he had been telling that his marriage was nearly over. Cynthia looked at him. "How long?" Gerald hesitated. "Several months," she nodded slowly. "How did it start?" "Work. That's not what I asked." Gerald rubbed his hands together. "We started talking." "About what?" "Things." "Gerald." He looked at her. "About us." Cynthia's face tightened. "You told her about our marriage?" "Yes." "What did you tell her?" Gerald looked down. "That we were having problems." "We were." "I told her I was unhappy." Cynthia nodded. "You were." Gerald looked at her. She wasn't defending him. She wasn't agreeing with him either. She was simply acknowledging facts. What else? I told her I didn't know where our marriage was going. Cynthia took a breath. And did you tell her you loved me? Gerald looked at her. I told her I was confused. Cynthia looked away. That answer hurt more than a direct yes would have. She stood. How long have you been sleeping with her? Gerald's voice was low. Some time. Cynthia nodded. She turned away. Gerald stood. I'm sorry. She looked back at him. Don't say that yet. He stopped. Why? Because I don't know what you're sorry for. Gerald looked at her. Everything. That's a word people use when they don't know where to start. He sat down again. Cynthia remained standing. She looked tired. Not dramatic. Not broken. Just tired. Does she know you're married? Yes. Does she know we're still together? Yes. Does she know you come home to me? Gerald hesitated. Yes. Cynthia nodded. She absorbed that. Then she asked, What did you tell her about me? Gerald looked ashamed. I told her we were unhappy. That isn't what I asked. He looked away. I told her you were distant. Cynthia nodded. Was I? Sometimes. Was I the reason you started seeing her? Gerald looked at her. No. The answer came quickly. Cynthia noticed. Then why? Gerald struggled. I like talking to her. That isn't enough. I felt understood. Cynthia looked at him. I was your wife. I know. You could have talked to me. I know. You could have told me you were unhappy. I know. You could have left. Gerald's eyes filled with regret. I know. Cynthia sat down. For several moments neither spoke. Then she asked, Why didn't you? Gerald stared at his hands. Because I was afraid. Of what? Of losing everything. Cynthia gave a small, sad laugh. You were already losing it. He looked at her. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was stating what she had finally understood. Gerald's phone vibrated. He looked at it. Zoe. Cynthia saw the name. She didn't reach for the phone. She didn't ask him to answer. She simply looked at him. She wants to know what happened. Gerald didn't answer. Cynthia nodded. Go ahead. No, answer her. I don't want to. Why? Because I'm here. Cynthia looked at him. You're here because you came home. Gerald remained silent. That's different. He understood what she meant. Being physically present was not the same as choosing honesty. He put the phone face down. Cynthia looked at it, then back at him. Who is Zoe? Gerald frowned. I just told you. No, she shook her head. You told me her name. She leaned back. I want to know who she is to you. Gerald struggled to answer. I care about her. Cynthia nodded. Do you love her? He looked down. I don't know. That answer hurt, but Cynthia preferred it to another lie. She nodded. Okay. Gerald looked at her. Okay. I'd rather hear that than have you tell me something because you think it's what I need to hear. He swallowed. Cynthia looked toward the window. I used to think the worst thing you could do to me was sleep with another woman. Gerald said nothing. I was wrong. She looked back at him. The worst part is that you came home and acted normal. Gerald closed his eyes. I know. You hugged me. I know. You told me you loved me. I did love you. Cynthia stared at him. Maybe you did. The words were quiet. That made them harder to hear. Gerald looked at her. I do. Cynthia didn't answer. She wasn't ready to decide what his love meant. Maybe he did love her. Maybe love did not make him incapable of betrayal. Maybe that was the part she had to understand before she could decide what happened next. Gerald stood. I'm going to sleep on the couch. Cynthia nodded. He picked up a pillow. Before he left the room, he stopped. Cynthia. She looked at him. I never wanted to hurt you. She held his gaze. I believe you. Gerald seemed surprised. Then she added, But you hurt me anyway. He nodded. There was nothing he could say to change that. He walked into the living room. Cynthia remained in the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about Zoe. She thought about Gerald. She thought about the woman she had imagined as the source of all her pain. But she couldn't reduce Zoe to a simple villain. Zoe had listened to Gerald. She had believed what he told her. She had asked him to make a decision. She had even told him that he needed to be honest with Cynthia. Zoe had still chosen to remain involved with a married man. That was her responsibility. But Gerald's choices belonged to Gerald. He had told Zoe only the parts of his marriage that supported what he wanted. He had told Cynthia only the parts of his life that allowed him to keep the peace. He had been telling different versions of the truth to different people. And somewhere in the middle, he had stopped telling himself the truth. Cynthia reached for her notebook. She opened it. Under what I know, she added, her name is Zoe. Then, Gerald says they have been involved for several months. She paused. She wrote, he told her we were unhappy. Then, he told me he was unhappy. She turned the page. Under what I don't know, she wrote. Whether he loves her, whether he wants to leave, whether he is capable of being honest now. She stared at the last sentence. Then she closed the notebook. Across the living room, Gerald was lying awake. His phone was beside him. Zoe had sent another message. Are you okay? Gerald read it. He didn't respond. For the first time, he understood that the question wasn't whether he could keep both relationships. He couldn't. The choice he had avoided had finally arrived without his permission. And Cynthia had not needed to scream to make him understand it. She had simply asked who Zoe was. Now Gerald had to decide whether he was finally going to live honestly with the answer. Gerald remained in the living room long after Cynthia had gone into the bedroom. The apartment was quiet. His phone was still beside him, but he no longer wanted to look at it. Zoe had sent another message. He left it unanswered. For once, Gerald understood that there was no message he could send that would make the situation easier. He eventually turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness. He barely slept. Cynthia didn't sleep much either. By 6 a.m, she was already in the kitchen. She stood at the counter making coffee because her hands needed something ordinary to do. The coffee maker sounded exactly as it always had. The refrigerator hummed. The same lemon-shaped magnet remained on the refrigerator door. The same 2 mugs sat beside the sink. Nothing in the apartment had changed. Everything had changed. Gerald walked into the kitchen. He stopped when he saw her. Morning. Cynthia looked at him. Morning. Neither mentioned the previous night. Gerald reached for a mug. Cynthia poured coffee into it. He looked at her. Thank you. She nodded. He sat at the kitchen table. Cynthia remained standing for a moment before sitting across from him. She folded her hands. I have more questions. Gerald nodded. Okay. I want you to answer them honestly. I will. She studied his face. How long? Gerald knew what she meant. Several months. How many? He hesitated. About 6. Cynthia looked down. 6 months. Half a year. 6 months of Thursdays. 6 months of coming home. 6 months of telling her he was working. She took a slow breath. The Thursday dinners. Yes. All of them? Most. She nodded. How many times did you take her to that restaurant? Gerald looked at the table. Several. Cynthia swallowed. The restaurant where you took me? Gerald looked up. He hadn't expected that question. Yes. Her expression changed. You knew. I didn't think about it. That's worse. Gerald lowered his eyes. Cynthia remembered that restaurant clearly. It had been during their first year of marriage. Gerald had surprised her after work. He had told her to dress nicely. She had asked why. He had smiled and said he wanted to take his wife somewhere special. They had sat at a table near the window. They had talked about their plans. They had laughed about how different married life felt from what they had imagined. Gerald had held her hand across the table. Now he had taken another woman there. Cynthia looked at him. Did you remember? Gerald was silent. I didn't think about it. She nodded slowly. That's what I'm trying to understand. What? How could you not think about it? Gerald didn't have an answer. He had spent so much time thinking about what he wanted that he had stopped considering what his actions meant to the person he had promised to love. Cynthia looked down at the table. What did you tell Zoe about us? Gerald took a breath. I told her we were unhappy. We were. I told her we had become distant. We had. What else? Gerald hesitated. I told her I wasn't sure our marriage was going to last. Cynthia looked at him. Did you tell her we were basically finished? He didn't answer. Gerald, yes. Cynthia leaned back. The answer hurt more than she expected. Not because he had described their problems. Their problems were real. She had admitted them herself. What hurt was that Gerald had taken the uncertainty inside their marriage and presented it to another woman, as though the decision had already been made. He had given Zoe a version of their marriage in which Cynthia was already being left. While Cynthia was still sitting beside him at home, making dinner. While she was still asking whether he had eaten. While she was still trying to understand why they felt distant. She looked at him. So you were ending our marriage without telling me? No. You told another woman we were essentially finished. I was confused. You weren't confused when you told her. Gerald lowered his head. Cynthia's voice remained calm. You knew enough to make her believe she had a future with you. He looked at her. I cared about her. I know. She paused. That's what makes this harder. Gerald reached across the table. Cynthia moved her hand away. He stopped. I'm sorry. She shook her head. Don't. He looked at her. I'm trying to apologize. I know. Then why? Because I'm not ready to hear an apology. Gerald went quiet. Cynthia looked at him. I need to understand what happened before I decide what your apology means. He nodded. She continued. You didn't make one mistake. Gerald looked at her. You made a decision every Thursday. The word sat between them. Gerald looked down. There was no defense he could offer. One mistake could be blamed on poor judgment. One lie could be called fear. One bad decision could be regretted. But 6 months of Thursdays were choices. He had chosen to leave the house. He had chosen to lie. He had chosen to meet Zoe. He had chosen to come home afterward. He had chosen to tell Cynthia he loved her. He had chosen to continue. Gerald finally whispered, You're right. Cynthia nodded. I know. She stood and took her mug to the sink. Gerald remained at the table. She didn't tell him their marriage was over. She didn't tell him she forgave him. She wasn't ready for either decision. For now, she needed the truth without having to decide its final meaning. She looked over her shoulder. Where are you sleeping tonight? Gerald understood. On the couch. Okay. He nodded. Cynthia turned back toward the sink. The kitchen remained quiet. Their marriage had not ended that morning, but the version of it they had both been pretending still existed was gone. The first morning after Gerald admitted the affair was strangely ordinary. That was what Cynthia found hardest to accept. The alarm still went off at the same time. The coffee maker still needed water. The refrigerator still had the groceries Gerald had bought 2 days earlier. Outside, cars moved through the Birmingham morning as they always did. Nothing in the world seemed to know that Cynthia's marriage had changed overnight. She woke before Gerald. For several seconds she forgot. Then she remembered. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked toward the living room. Gerald was asleep on the couch. She had told him to sleep there. He had listened. Cynthia went into the kitchen. She started coffee. A few minutes later, Gerald walked in. His hair was disheveled from sleeping on the couch. Morning. Morning. He looked toward the coffee maker. Can I? Cynthia nodded. He poured himself a cup. Neither of them knew what to say. Eventually, Gerald asked, Do you want breakfast? Cynthia looked at him. No, I can make something. I'm not hungry. He nodded. He stood there holding his coffee. The silence was different now. Before, silence had been something Cynthia had tried to fix. Now she understood that some silence needed to exist. Gerald finally said, I'm going to make an appointment with a counselor. Cynthia looked at him. Okay. I need to figure out why I did this. She nodded. That's your work. I know. And I don't want you doing it because you think it will make me stay. Gerald looked at her. I don't. Cynthia held his gaze. Good. She walked toward the bedroom. Gerald remained in the kitchen. That afternoon he contacted a counselor. He didn't tell Cynthia immediately. For once, he wasn't trying to earn credit for doing something he should have done anyway. He simply made the appointment. Cynthia continued seeing her own counselor. Their sessions became less about proving whether Gerald had betrayed her, and more about understanding what Cynthia needed to rebuild her own stability. She was beginning to realize that the affair had not only damaged her trust in Gerald, it had damaged her trust in her own judgment. For months, she had seen things. She had noticed the Thursday dinners, the receipts, the changed password, the jewelry box. She had sensed something was wrong. Yet every time she had questioned herself. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she was being unfair. Maybe marriage required more patience. Maybe Gerald was simply stressed. Her counselor helped her separate patience from self-abandonment. You can give someone room without abandoning your own instincts, the counselor told her. Cynthia thought about that for several days. It made sense. She had spent so much time trying not to be suspicious that she had ignored the fact that she was uncomfortable. She didn't want to make that mistake again. At home, Gerald began changing his routine. He stopped contacting Zoe. That decision was his. Cynthia did not ask him to show her every message. She did not demand screenshots. She didn't want to become the manager of his honesty. Gerald told Zoe that their relationship had to end. The conversation was difficult. Zoe was hurt. She asked whether he was ending things because Cynthia had caught him. Gerald told her the truth. Cynthia knowing had forced him to stop avoiding the consequences, but the responsibility was his. He had made choices before Cynthia knew. He had to own them now. After the call, Gerald sat alone in his car for several minutes. He wanted to feel relieved. Instead, he felt the weight of what he had done. He had hurt Cynthia. He had hurt Zoe. He had damaged his own character, and there was no single conversation that could repair any of it. Back at home, Cynthia was reviewing their financial information. She had already started doing this before the confession. Now she knew why it mattered. Gerald sat across from her one evening. "I can show you everything." Cynthia looked at him. "I don't want you to show me because you're afraid. I'm not. I want to understand it myself." Gerald nodded. "Okay." They went through the accounts together. Cynthia discovered that Gerald had a separate savings account she had known existed but had never paid much attention to. There were also work-related accounts connected to his property management responsibilities. Nothing indicated that he had secretly drained their household finances for Zoe. That was a relief. But she discovered other things she should have known. There were insurance details Gerald had always handled, a credit card she rarely used, several automatic payments she hadn't realized were connected to their shared expenses. None of it was catastrophic. That wasn't the point. The point was that Cynthia had allowed Gerald to become the person who knew more about their financial life than she did. She had trusted him. Trust wasn't wrong. But understanding her own financial position was still her responsibility. She looked at the paperwork. "I should have known this." Gerald nodded. "Probably." She looked at him. "Don't agree just to make me feel better. I'm not." He paused. "I should have made sure you knew too." Cynthia looked down. That was another consequence of his secrecy. It had forced her to become more independent in areas where she had once simply assumed they were functioning as a team. They began dividing responsibilities. Cynthia took over certain bills. Gerald continued handling others. They created a shared list of household expenses. They discussed savings. They discussed insurance. They discussed what each of them owed. The conversations were uncomfortable. They were also necessary. One evening, Cynthia closed the laptop. "I don't want to talk about money anymore tonight." Gerald nodded. "Okay." He stood. "Do you want tea?" She looked at him. "Yes." He went into the kitchen. Cynthia watched him prepare it. A few months earlier she might have considered the moment ordinary. Now she understood that ordinary moments had become opportunities to see whether Gerald's behavior matched his words. He brought her the cup. "Careful, it's hot." "Thank you." He sat across from her. Neither spoke. There was no romantic gesture, no promise, no speech, just two people sitting in the same room, trying to figure out how to live after one of them had broken something important. Cynthia didn't know whether their marriage would survive. Gerald didn't know either. That uncertainty was difficult for him. He wanted answers. He wanted to know whether she would stay. He wanted to know whether she still loved him. He wanted to know whether there was a path back. But Cynthia wasn't ready to give him those answers. She was busy answering a different question. Could she trust herself again? That question had to come first. One Saturday morning, Gerald was making breakfast. He cracked eggs into a bowl. Cynthia stood near the counter drinking coffee. "Do you want toast?" "Yes." He put bread into the toaster. The ordinary routine almost felt uncomfortable. Gerald looked at her. "How are you?" She thought about it. "Better than I was." He nodded. "That's good, but not okay." His face fell slightly. "I understand." "Not understanding that." "I won't." He returned to the stove. Cynthia watched him. He wasn't asking her to reassure him. He wasn't asking whether she forgave him. He wasn't telling her how much he had changed. He was simply cooking breakfast. It was a small thing. But Cynthia noticed. The difference between remorse and accountability was beginning to become clearer to her. Remorse wanted relief. Accountability accepted discomfort. Gerald was beginning to understand that his job wasn't to make Cynthia feel better quickly. His job was to become trustworthy whether or not she rewarded him for it. The marriage was not repaired. Cynthia hadn't forgiven him. Gerald hadn't earned back her trust. But something important had begun. Cynthia was no longer rebuilding the marriage first. She was rebuilding herself. And whatever happened to their relationship afterward would have to grow from that stronger foundation. 3 weeks passed before Gerald asked Cynthia the question he had been carrying around since the confession. They were sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. Cynthia was reviewing some paperwork. Gerald had just finished making coffee. He sat across from her.
"Cynthia?"
She looked up. "Yes? Can I ask you something?" She put the papers down. "Sure." Gerald hesitated. "Are you going to stay?" Cynthia looked at him for several seconds. She had expected the question eventually. She just hadn't expected how difficult it would be to answer. "I don't know." Gerald looked down. "Okay." He nodded, but she could see the disappointment in his face. He had wanted something more. She understood that. But she wasn't going to give him an answer simply because uncertainty was uncomfortable for him. Gerald looked at her again. "Do you still love me?" Cynthia took a breath. "That's not the same question. I know, but you're asking it because you want to know whether there's still a chance." Gerald nodded. "Yes." Cynthia looked at her hands. I still love you. His shoulders relaxed slightly. But that doesn't mean everything is okay. I know. And it doesn't mean I'm staying. Gerald swallowed. I understand. Cynthia studied him. Do you? He nodded. I think I'm learning. She appreciated the word. Learning. Not fixing. Not changing everything. Learning. She picked up her papers again. Gerald remained seated. After a few moments, he asked another question. Do you forgive me? Cynthia looked up. I don't know. He nodded. The answer clearly hurt him. She could see it. But he didn't argue. That mattered. A month earlier, Gerald might have tried to convince her. He might have said he had apologized. He might have reminded her that he had stopped seeing Zoe. He might have asked what else he could possibly do. Instead, he simply sat there. Cynthia said, Your discomfort with not knowing can't become another thing I have to manage. Gerald looked at her. What do you mean? You want certainty. Yes, I understand. She paused. But I can't give you certainty just because you're uncomfortable. Gerald nodded slowly. I know. Forgiveness isn't something I can promise on a schedule. I understand. And if I forgive you someday, it doesn't mean what happened becomes acceptable. I know. Cynthia looked at him. Forgiveness isn't a reset button. Gerald lowered his eyes. No. It doesn't erase the 6 months. I know. It doesn't erase the lies. I know. It doesn't mean I suddenly trust you. I know. She watched him. He wasn't defending himself. That was new. He was listening. Over the following months, Gerald began doing something he had never been good at. He stopped trying to control Cynthia's reaction. If she was quiet, he didn't demand to know what was wrong. If she had a difficult day, he didn't tell her they needed to move forward. If she became distant after remembering something, he didn't complain that she was punishing him. He learned to ask, Do you want to talk about it? Sometimes Cynthia said yes. Sometimes she said no. Gerald accepted both answers. He also became more transparent. His phone remained on the kitchen counter. He stopped turning the screen away whenever Cynthia entered the room. If someone called while they were together, he didn't automatically leave the room. Not because Cynthia had demanded access, because he understood why secrecy had become painful. One evening, his phone rang while they were having dinner. Gerald looked at the screen. It's work, he answered. Cynthia continued eating. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When he ended the call, he placed the phone back on the table. He didn't explain who had called unless she asked. She didn't ask. That was progress, too. Cynthia was learning that rebuilding trust did not mean monitoring Gerald. It meant having fewer reasons to monitor him. There were still difficult moments. One Thursday evening, Gerald mentioned that he had a work dinner. Cynthia's hand stopped while she was putting food onto her plate. Gerald noticed. He didn't become defensive. I'm meeting a property owner. Cynthia nodded. Okay. He paused. If Thursday is difficult for you, I can handle it differently. She looked at him. No. You sure? Yes. She took a breath. Thursday isn't the problem. Gerald waited. The choices you made on Thursdays were... He nodded. I understand. He didn't ask her to reassure him. He didn't say that he wasn't Zoe. He didn't tell her she needed to trust him. He simply accepted what she said. That night, Cynthia slept badly. The next morning, she told Gerald, I had a rough night. He looked at her. I'm sorry. She nodded. I know it's not your fault that I remembered. I know, but it's still something you caused. Gerald looked down. You're right. That was all. No defense. No attempt to explain. Cynthia noticed. There was a time when Gerald would have tried to make the conversation disappear. Now he stayed present. That didn't erase what he had done, but it changed how Cynthia experienced him. Months passed. They continued counseling separately. Eventually they had a few sessions together. Those conversations were not easy. Cynthia told Gerald things she had never said during their marriage. She told him that his affair had made her question whether she had been enough. She told him she had replayed ordinary moments in her mind. The nights he came home late, the times he had kissed her after seeing Zoe, the Thursdays she had eaten alone, the jewelry box, the restaurant. Gerald listened. He didn't tell her she was wrong to feel that way. He didn't tell her that she was making him feel guilty. He accepted that she had a right to the pain his choices had created. Gerald also had to confront something about himself. He had spent months blaming his loneliness for his behavior. He eventually understood that loneliness could explain why he was vulnerable to attention. It could not excuse the decisions that followed. He had been unhappy. He had been afraid. He had wanted to feel understood. None of those things forced him to lie. That distinction became important. His counselor asked him once, "What did you believe you were entitled to?" Gerald had no answer. Later he understood. He had acted as though his unhappiness entitled him to another relationship before he had honestly ended the first. That was the part he had been avoiding. His marriage had problems, but instead of addressing them, he had created a second life. Cynthia noticed a difference over time. Not because Gerald made grand declarations, he didn't. He simply became consistent. If he said he would be home at 7, he called when plans changed. If he made a mistake, he admitted it. If he didn't know something, he said he didn't know. If Cynthia asked a difficult question, he answered it. Sometimes the answer was uncomfortable. He still answered. That mattered more than promises. One evening, Cynthia came home from work visibly frustrated. Gerald was in the kitchen. He looked at her. "Bad day?" She dropped her bag on the chair. "Terrible." He waited. "What happened?" She told him. It had nothing to do with their marriage. It was a problem at work. Gerald listened. When she finished, he said, "That sounds exhausting." "Thank you." He nodded. She walked toward the refrigerator. "Do we have anything to eat? I can make something." She smiled. "That would be nice." Gerald began preparing dinner. Cynthia stood beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then she said, "I noticed something." "What?" "You don't explain yourself as much anymore." Gerald smiled faintly. "I used to." "All the time." He nodded. "I think I was trying to convince you." "Of what?" "That I was a good person." Cynthia looked at him. "And now?" Gerald continued chopping vegetables. "Now I think I have to behave like one." Cynthia said nothing. She let the sentence sit. It was probably the most honest thing he had said in months. Their marriage still wasn't what it had been. Some wounds took longer than others. There were days Cynthia felt close to him. There were other days when an ordinary Thursday could bring back memories she hadn't expected. She didn't hide those days. Gerald didn't resent them. They were learning to live with the consequences instead of pretending consequences were evidence that healing had failed. One afternoon, several months after the confession, Gerald came home from work. He placed his keys on the counter, then his wallet, then his phone. He walked into the kitchen to wash his hands. Cynthia was already there. She looked at the phone. It was lying face up. She noticed that because, months earlier, Gerald had always turned it face down. Now he hadn't. Cynthia reached for her coffee. She didn't touch the phone. She didn't check it. She didn't even ask who had called last. Gerald returned. He saw her looking in the phone's direction. For a moment his expression tightened. Old fear, old habit. Then he relaxed. He picked up the phone only because he needed it to check the time. Cynthia watched him. Nothing dramatic happened. No revelation, no declaration, no promise. Just a phone sitting openly on the kitchen counter. Cynthia looked at it one more time. Then she looked at Gerald. She still wasn't sure what the future held. She wasn't ready to say their marriage had been repaired, but she knew something had changed. For the first time in a long time, she had seen Gerald leave something private in plain sight without expecting her to prove that she trusted him. And for the first time in a long time, she had looked at something she could have checked, and chosen not to. Trust had not returned. But perhaps slowly, they were learning how to build the conditions in which it could return. That was not forgiveness. Not yet. It was something smaller. And for Cynthia, something more honest. Months passed without either of them announcing that their marriage was healed. Cynthia preferred it that way. There had been no dramatic morning when she woke up and suddenly felt completely safe again. No single conversation had erased the 6 months of lies. Gerald had stopped seeing Zoe. He had continued counseling. He had become more open about his schedule, his finances, his phone, and the parts of his life he had once kept separate. But trust did not return because a person behaved properly for a few weeks. Cynthia knew that now. Trust was built through repetition, through consistency, through the quiet moments when nobody was watching. Their marriage had become less polished and more honest. That did not always make it easier. One Tuesday evening, Cynthia came home from work exhausted. Gerald was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. "You look tired," he said. "I am." "Bad day?" She put her bag down. "Very." Gerald waited. She looked at him. "I don't want to talk about work." "Okay." That was one of the changes. Before everything happened, Gerald might have kept asking. Now he knew that listening also meant knowing when to stop. Cynthia washed her hands and sat at the table. Gerald served dinner. They ate quietly. Halfway through the meal, Cynthia said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you ever get tired of having to prove you're different?" Gerald put his fork down. "Sometimes." Cynthia nodded. "Thank you for being honest." He looked at her. But I need you to understand something. I do. I'm not asking you to prove anything forever. I know. I'm trying to decide whether the person you are now is someone I can build a life with. Gerald nodded. I understand. That means I'm going to notice things. I know. And sometimes I may remember things when you don't expect me to. I know. She looked at him. That doesn't mean I'm trying to punish you. I don't think you are. Gerald took a breath. I think sometimes I want the past to be finished because I'm ashamed of it. Cynthia looked down. But it's not finished for me just because you're ashamed. I understand. That was the kind of conversation they had learned to have, not always perfectly. Sometimes one of them became defensive. Sometimes Cynthia walked away because she needed time. Sometimes Gerald said the wrong thing and had to apologize. But the difference was that they returned to the conversation. They no longer allowed silence to become the permanent language between them. One evening, Cynthia brought up something that had bothered her for several days. Gerald was sitting on the couch. She stood near the doorway. Can we talk? He turned toward her. Of course. She sat down. I've been thinking about our marriage before Zoe. Gerald became quiet. What about it? We were already unhappy. He nodded. Yes. I don't want us to pretend the affair was the only problem. It wasn't. Cynthia looked at him. But I also don't want us to make the mistake of saying our problems somehow caused it. Gerald shook his head. They didn't. I need you to remember that. I do. She leaned back. We had problems. You made a choice. Yes, I had problems too. Gerald looked at her. I know. I stopped telling you when I was lonely. He listened. I thought if I kept things peaceful, eventually we'd become close again. Gerald lowered his eyes. I did something similar. You complained to Zoe. Yes, you talked about our problems with another woman instead of talking to me. Yes, Cynthia nodded. We both avoided difficult conversations. Gerald looked at her. But only one of us had an affair. I know. She appreciated that he said it without hesitation. There was no attempt to make their responsibilities equal. Their marriage had weaknesses. Gerald's betrayal was still his decision. That distinction had become important to both of them. Cynthia reached for her coffee. I don't want to go back. Gerald looked at her. Back where? To the marriage we had before. He seemed surprised. I thought that's what we were trying to save. Cynthia shook her head. No. She looked directly at him. I don't want to save the version of us that became so quiet that neither of us knew how unhappy the other person was. Gerald was silent. I want to know whether we can build something different. He nodded slowly. What would different look like? Cynthia thought about it. Talking before resentment becomes distance. Okay. Being honest even when honesty is uncomfortable. Okay. Knowing our finances together. Yes. Having separate interests without becoming strangers. Yes. And I don't want to become the woman who stays quiet just to keep the house peaceful. Gerald looked at her. You won't. Cynthia's expression softened. I can't promise that I'll always communicate perfectly. I don't expect you to. But I won't disappear inside this marriage again. Gerald nodded. I don't want you to. For a moment neither spoke. Cynthia looked at him. I don't know what we're going to become. Gerald gave a small nod. Neither do I. That answer was strangely comforting. There was a time when uncertainty had frightened them. Now they were learning to tolerate it. They didn't need to decide the entire future in one conversation. They needed to decide what they would do today. Gerald reached for her hand. He stopped before touching it. He waited. Cynthia noticed. After a moment she placed her hand in his. He held it gently. There was affection there. But it was different from before, less automatic, more deliberate. They were no longer pretending that love alone could repair what had happened. They were learning that love needed honesty, boundaries, patience, and behavior to support it. Cynthia looked at their joined hands. We're still figuring this out. I know. And some days are going to be hard. I know. She smiled faintly. You say that a lot now. Gerald smiled. I'm trying not to pretend I know everything. She laughed softly. It was a small laugh, but it was real. Gerald smiled. For the first time in a long time, neither of them was trying to make the moment mean more than it did. They were simply sitting together, still uncertain, still carrying the past, still choosing one ordinary day at a time to see whether something healthier could grow from what remained. It was several months after the night at the restaurant when Cynthia finally brought it up. They were driving home from dinner, not the restaurant where Gerald had taken Zoe. A different one. Cynthia had chosen it. Gerald was driving, and the conversation had been easy until they reached a familiar stretch of road. Cynthia looked out the passenger window. I never told you why I sent that note. Gerald's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. The restaurant? Yes. He glanced at her. I've wondered. Cynthia nodded. I figured you had. They drove for another few seconds. I didn't go there to embarrass you, she said. I know. I wasn't trying to humiliate Zoe either. Gerald looked ahead. I know. I thought about going inside. He looked at her. Really? Yes, what stopped you? Cynthia looked down at her hands. I didn't want strangers watching me discover my marriage had changed. Gerald said nothing. I didn't want to stand across from you and Zoe while everyone around us tried not to look. She paused. And I didn't want to make a decision while I was angry. Gerald nodded. That sounded like Cynthia. Even at her most hurt, she had been thinking about what she could live with afterward. I came earlier, she continued. I spoke to the restaurant. Gerald looked at her. You arranged the envelope. Yes. How did you know I'd be there? The reservation? He nodded. She had seen enough from their financial information and the information available to her to know where he was going. She didn't explain every detail. She didn't need to. I sat in my car for a while, Cynthia said. Gerald glanced at her. What were you thinking? Too many things. She smiled faintly. I thought about walking in. What made you stay? I realized I didn't want you to see me before you had to decide what you were going to do. Gerald was quiet. Cynthia continued. I had spent weeks asking questions. Yes. I had asked you where you were. Yes. I had asked whether you were happy. Yes. And every time, you gave me something that was close enough to an answer to keep the conversation moving. Gerald lowered his eyes briefly. So I stopped asking. She looked out the window. I wanted to know whether you would tell me the truth if I wasn't standing in front of you. Gerald understood. The envelope hadn't been a trap. It had been a final opportunity. He had been sitting across from Zoe, talking about leaving Cynthia. He had been promising Zoe that things were going to change. At that exact moment, Cynthia had already known enough to give him one last chance to choose honesty. Gerald swallowed. When the waiter said, "Your wife sent this," I felt like the entire room changed. Cynthia looked at him. I know. I thought you were going to come through the door. I considered it. But you didn't. No. Why? Cynthia smiled faintly. Because I didn't want revenge. Gerald looked at her. I wanted truth. He nodded. I understand that now. They drove another block. Cynthia said, Do you know what hurt me most? Gerald's voice was quiet. What? Not that you took Zoe to that restaurant. He looked surprised. It wasn't? No. She paused. What hurt was that you had once taken me there because you wanted to celebrate our marriage. Gerald looked down. I know. You said you wanted us to come back years later and remember how happy we were. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. I remember. I don't think you remembered when you made that reservation. No. Cynthia nodded. That's what scared me. What? How disconnected you had become from the meaning of things. Gerald didn't answer. Cynthia looked at him. You weren't just lying to me. She took a breath. You were living a separate life. Gerald nodded. I was. And I was still living in the marriage. Yes. They drove in silence for a moment. Cynthia continued. I also need to say something about myself. Gerald looked at her. I stayed quiet too often. He didn't interrupt. I noticed we were becoming distant. Yes. I knew I was lonely. Yes. But I kept telling myself things would get better. She looked out the window. I thought keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting the marriage. Gerald nodded. I did something similar. You avoided difficult conversations. Yes. You complained to someone else instead of bringing your unhappiness home. Yes. Cynthia looked at him. But I don't want us to confuse those things. We shouldn't. Our communication problems didn't make you have an affair. I know. You chose that. I did. She nodded. That distinction mattered. There was a temptation after betrayal to divide responsibility so neatly that nobody had to carry the uncomfortable truth. Cynthia didn't want that. She could acknowledge her own silence without accepting responsibility for Gerald's affair. Gerald understood that now. I wish I'd talked to you sooner, he said. So do I. I thought you wouldn't understand. Cynthia looked at him. Did you give me the chance? No. That's the part I wish we'd done differently. Gerald nodded. They turned into their neighborhood. The houses passed slowly outside the windows. I used to think honesty meant telling someone everything the moment you thought it, Cynthia said. Gerald glanced at her. What do you think now? I think honesty also means being willing to have the conversation before the problem becomes impossible to ignore. Gerald considered that. That makes sense. You don't wait until you're resentful. No, you don't let yourself build a private argument in your head for months. No, you don't start looking for emotional comfort somewhere else. Gerald nodded. And if you reach a point where you don't want the marriage anymore, Cynthia said, you say that before starting another relationship. Gerald's voice was quiet. Yes, he knew that lesson belonged to him. Not Cynthia, not Zoe, him. They reached the driveway. Gerald turned off the engine. Neither immediately got out. Cynthia looked at him. Do you know what I realized after that night? What? I didn't need to catch you. Gerald looked at her. I needed to stop lying to myself. He nodded. She continued. Once I stopped doing that, I could make decisions based on what was actually happening instead of what I hoped was happening. Gerald looked down. That probably made it easier to leave. Cynthia considered the question. It made it easier to choose. He looked at her. There's a difference. Yes. She opened the car door. Gerald remained seated for a moment. Cynthia. She turned. Thank you. She frowned slightly. For what? For not humiliating me. She looked at him. I wasn't protecting you. I know. I was protecting myself. Gerald nodded. Still. Cynthia gave him a small smile. Let's go inside. They walked into the house together. The kitchen looked almost exactly as it had that night. The same counter, the same cabinets, the same table. Gerald placed his keys down. Cynthia took off her coat. For a moment, neither moved. Then Gerald said, I'm glad we can talk about it now. Cynthia nodded. Me too. He looked at her. I don't ever want to be that man again. Cynthia didn't answer immediately. Then she said, Don't tell me. Gerald waited. Show me. He nodded. I will. Cynthia walked toward the kitchen. Gerald followed. There was no dramatic embrace, no declaration that everything was finally healed. The restaurant still existed in their memories. The affair still existed in their history. But they could finally talk about both without pretending they hadn't happened. And perhaps that was one of the first real signs that they were building something different. Not because the past had disappeared, because they were finally willing to look at it together. By the time Cynthia made her decision, she had stopped looking for a perfect answer. There wasn't one. She had learned that during the months after the affair. A marriage could contain love and damage at the same time. A person could regret what they had done and still have to live with its consequences. Two people could acknowledge their failures without pretending those failures were equal. And forgiveness, if it came, did not have to arrive before a decision. Cynthia understood that now. She and Gerald were sitting at the kitchen table one Saturday morning, the same table where she had once questioned him about his Thursday dinners, the same place where he had eventually admitted the affair, the same place where they had gone through their finances and begun learning how to speak honestly again. Gerald had coffee in front of him. Cynthia had tea. Neither was rushing. Gerald looked at her. You've been quiet. I've been thinking. About us? Yes. Gerald nodded. He didn't ask what she had decided. That was important. Months earlier, he would have pushed for an answer. Now he waited. Cynthia looked at him. I want to stay. Gerald's face changed. Not dramatically, just enough for Cynthia to see how much the words meant to him. He took a breath. Okay, but I need you to understand what I mean. I will. I am not saying everything is fixed. I know. I'm not saying I trust you completely. I know. I'm not saying what happened doesn't matter anymore. I know. She looked at him. I'm saying I'm willing to keep building this marriage. Gerald nodded. Under different conditions. Yes. What conditions? Cynthia thought carefully. I won't stay quiet because I'm afraid a difficult conversation might create conflict. Gerald nodded. I won't expect you to read my mind. I won't expect you to read mine either. If something is wrong, we talk about it. Yes, if either of us becomes unhappy, we say so before we start looking outside the marriage for comfort. Gerald looked down. Yes, and if you ever reach a point where you don't want this marriage anymore, I need you to tell me. I will, even if it hurts, especially if it hurts. Cynthia nodded. That answer mattered. She leaned back. There is something else. Gerald waited. I am going to keep my own financial independence. He nodded. I think that's good. I want to understand our finances. Yes, and I want my own savings. You should. Cynthia studied him. You aren't going to argue? No. Why? Because I understand now that trust doesn't mean one person stops paying attention to their own life. Cynthia smiled faintly. That's probably one of the first smart things you've said this morning. Gerald laughed softly. I'll take that. The moment became lighter, not because the past had disappeared, because they had finally learned that every conversation did not have to end in pain. Gerald reached across the table. He stopped before touching her hand. Cynthia noticed. She placed her hand over his. He held it. I'm grateful you're giving us another chance, he said. Cynthia looked at him. Don't call it a chance you were given. Gerald waited. Call it work we're both choosing. He nodded. Okay. She squeezed his hand. I'm choosing it. So am I. They sat quietly. Cynthia looked around the kitchen. For a long time she had believed that saving a marriage meant returning it to the way it had been. She no longer believed that. The old marriage had been built around assumptions. Gerald assumed Cynthia would understand without being told. Cynthia assumed silence could protect peace. Gerald assumed his unhappiness justified looking elsewhere. Cynthia assumed that because they loved each other, they would eventually find their way back without having to confront what was wrong. Those assumptions had failed them. Whatever they built now would have to be different. Not perfect. Different. Later that afternoon, Gerald went outside to handle some work. Cynthia remained in the kitchen. His phone was sitting on the counter. Face up, unlocked. She noticed it. For a second an old instinct appeared. She could check it. She could look at his messages. She could search his recent calls. She could confirm that nothing had changed. Her hand moved slightly toward it, then stopped. She didn't touch it. Not because she was certain nothing was there. Because she had reached a different understanding of trust. If Gerald returned to secrecy, she would eventually know through his behavior. She didn't need to spend her life policing him. The door opened. Gerald walked back inside. He saw the phone on the counter. He looked at Cynthia. She was preparing lunch. He didn't move the phone. Neither did she. He washed his hands. What are you making? Sandwiches. Can I have one? You can make your own. He smiled. Fair. He began taking things from the refrigerator. Cynthia watched him. This was what their life looked like now. Not dramatic, not perfect, not romantic every minute. Just two people learning how to share a home honestly. They ate lunch at the kitchen table. Gerald asked about her work. Cynthia asked about a property issue he had mentioned earlier. They discussed weekend plans. They disagreed about what to watch that evening. Cynthia laughed at something Gerald said. He smiled. It felt ordinary. And ordinary was valuable now. Because Cynthia knew how easily ordinary life could hide problems. A quiet house did not always mean a peaceful marriage. A husband coming home every night did not automatically mean he was emotionally present. A wife avoiding arguments did not automatically mean she was content. Silence could look peaceful while a relationship was quietly falling apart. Cynthia had learned that the hard way. Gerald had learned something too. Remorse was not measured by how badly he felt after being caught. It was measured by what he did when nobody was forcing him to behave differently. He had to continue doing the work, continue speaking honestly, continue accepting that Cynthia might remember, continue understanding that trust was hers to give, not his to demand. And Cynthia had her own work. She had to keep speaking, keep setting boundaries, keep protecting her financial independence, keep remembering that loving Gerald did not require abandoning herself. That was the part she had understood most clearly. She could love him and still protect herself. She could stay without pretending everything was fine. She could forgive someday without pretending the betrayal never happened. She could believe in their future without surrendering her judgment. That evening, Gerald was washing dishes while Cynthia dried them. He handed her a plate. She dried it. Another, then another. Nothing special, nothing dramatic. Just a married couple doing something ordinary together. Gerald looked at her. Thank you. For what? For staying. Cynthia placed the plate in the cabinet. I'm not staying because I forgot. I know. I'm staying because I believe there may still be something worth building. Gerald nodded. I believe that too. She closed the cabinet. Then let's build it. He smiled. One day at a time? Cynthia smiled back. One honest conversation at a time. Gerald laughed. I can do that. I hope so. They returned to the kitchen. His phone remained on the counter. Cynthia didn't look at it. She didn't need to. The future was no longer about proving whether Gerald could hide something. It was about whether both of them could live honestly enough that hiding no longer had a place in their marriage. And that was the choice Cynthia made. Not a perfect reconciliation. Not an erasure of what happened. Not a promise that there would never be another difficult day. She chose the possibility of a different marriage. Gerald chose the responsibility that came with it, and for the first time since their marriage had begun to grow quiet, neither of them was pretending that love alone would be enough. They were going to have to communicate. They were going to have to listen. They were going to have to tell the truth before resentment became distance. They were going to have to keep choosing each other freely rather than assuming marriage meant the choice no longer mattered. Cynthia looked across the kitchen at Gerald. He was drying his hands. She smiled. He smiled back. Nothing about the moment looked extraordinary. That was exactly why it mattered. Their marriage was not magically repaired. It was simply honest now. And sometimes, a new beginning does not look like starting over. Sometimes it looks like two people finally understanding what they should have been doing all along. If this story stayed with you, share what you think Cynthia's decision meant to her. And if you enjoy stories about choices, consequences, and second chances, stay with Mr. Gray Stories for the next one.